21. Shock in the Room of Requirement. Hey, Baron! Merry Christmas! After a semester of getting along, Avada and Baron had become trusted friends. Baron had even agreed to take part in Avada's mental link experiment, and it had worked. On Christmas morning, Avada got up early and went to the Great Hall. A few students were staying at school. They exchanged greetings and helped themselves to the seasonal cakes, gingerbread, and hot black tea the house elves had prepared. From across the room, Avada spotted Baron coming in through the main doors and stood to greet him. "Merry Christmas, Ken," Avada called. Baron smiled and settled into the seat opposite him. There weren't enough people around to require separate tables. "How do you like the gift I sent you? Satisfied?" "I couldn't be more," Avada said. Baron had had one of his family's library books sent, a modern treatise on the study of mind magic and the history of psychic research. Avada had been fascinated by the opening pages alone. Baron had arranged it after participating in the mental link experiment and learning what Avada was researching. The gift felt thoughtful and rare. The present also left Avada with a small dilemma. Baron was a pure-blood noble and hardly needed galleons. A surgical talent optimization wasn't something Avada could do in a day. He'd already taught Baron the basics of the mental link, so that didn't count, and a plate of homemade cookies like the other Hufflepuffs would have felt too trite. In the end, he'd chosen something unusual and, he hoped, priceless in its own way, and he'd been keeping Baron in suspense since yesterday. "I got my family's present this morning," Baron said happily. It was rare to see him so openly pleased. "It's a quill that writes in the air. If it's windy, the script even changes font and color with the breeze. I'll show you later." Avada felt a brief sting. He had no family in this life, and his old friends at the orphanage didn't even know where he was. He'd sent them some homemade sweets and a letter updating them on his life, carefully leaving out anything about magic. He let the thought go and switched to the mental link voice they shared. "Let's not talk gifts yet. Come see the present I mentioned. It's ready. I'll take you after we finish." Baron's eating speed suddenly doubled. Avada finished first. Nobility or not, he wasn't going to rush a pastry, but when Baron finally swallowed the last bite and dabbed his mouth with a napkin, Avada stood and beckoned. "Follow me." "What are we doing?" Baron asked as Avada led him up the staircases. He couldn't imagine what kind of gift needed to be prepared in a special place so far from the Hufflepuff common room. "8th floor. You'll see." Avada had decided, after thinking it through, to reveal the Room of Requirement as his gift. The most important item that had been kept in that room, Ravenclaw's diadem, was already moved elsewhere by Avada. The vanishing cabinet was damaged. The room's existence was hardly a tightly kept secret. Avada was sure others at the school knew of it, and there were probably traces left behind. More than that, it was simply fun and magical. Who would refuse a place that could fulfill wishes? They stopped opposite the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy being thrashed by a troll. Avada faced the wall. "All right, it's here." Baron looked around, puzzled. "So what have you prepared?" "That depends on what you need. What do you want right now?" Avada said, suppressing a grin at Baron's bewildered look. Baron blinked, then realized Avada wasn't joking. He hesitated. "I want to learn more. Knowledge." "Okay, preparing it now." Avada walked once, twice, 3 times along the wall. A smooth doorway appeared where there had been none. He pushed it open and revealed a library lined with bookshelves. "A hidden library?" Baron whispered, awed. He didn't rush in. He stood outside, touching the new door as if he wanted to make sure it was real. "No, if it's just this, how did you know I'd wish for knowledge?" "Because it's not just a library," Avada said, smiling. "It's the Room of Requirement." He showed Baron how it worked. Skeptical at first, Baron began to pace, push doors, and step into rooms. Training rooms, sitting rooms, washrooms, kitchens, greenhouses, classrooms, anything Avada suggested, the room supplied. Baron bounced from one surprise to the next, wide-eyed and delighted. He pushed through doors, peered into spaces, and came back for more. After what felt like forever, Baron finally paused, having exhausted the obvious ideas. He closed the last door and looked at Avada with pure joy. "Thank you, Ken. This is the best gift ever." "Glad you like it," Avada said, proud. Then he tilted his head. "But I watched you try things just now, and you still missed the most valuable room." "There's another room?" Baron asked. Try pacing 3 times while silently thinking, I need a place to hide things. Baron's eyes lit up. He began to pace back and forth, concentrating as instructed. On the last step, the doorway formed again. He shoved it open and gasped. The room was a chaotic treasure trove, a jumble of objects piled in dizzying heaps. Baron rushed in, touching and lifting things, voice full of childlike excitement. Is that the goblet of fire? By Merlin! It's still warm after all these years, he exclaimed. A half-assembled golden snitch. Look at the mechanism, he whispered, peering close. I've never seen one from the inside. What is this? Some sort of seeker's broom. This egg, it's huge. It can't be a dragon egg. Oh, it's fake. That doll, so lifelike, like a real person. Then Baron stopped, a sharp note of alarm in his voice. No, Ken, come here. It's Professor Baker. He's collapsed here. What? Avada lunged forward, dodging around piles of clutter. He found Baron crouched anxiously beside a man in a black wizard's robe, unconscious on the floor, Professor Benjamin Baker. A fist-sized black crystal orb lay silently a short distance away, rolled onto its side. Something's wrong. Baron, get back! When Avada swept his magical senses over Professor Baker and the black orb, every hair on his body rose. His face went pale as he shouted for Baron. Baron jumped up, backing away a few steps and drawing his wand from his waist. What's wrong? He asked in a low, cautious voice. To Baron, Professor Baker was a reliable, kindly teacher, a trusted member of the Black Magic Defense League's board, someone Dumbledore had vouched for, and the man whose spectacular duel had been broadcast at the start of the year. Whatever had knocked him out, he should be helped, not suspected. Avada did not answer immediately. He drew his wand too, his expression grave, and moved closer to Baker's still form. Do you see that black orb next to him? He said quietly to Baron. I think it's a dark artifact. And I'm certain it wasn't here before, Avada continued. It must have been brought in by Professor Baker or created by him. Are you sure? Baron's eyes widened. The idea that a member of the Black Magic Defense League might be in possession of a dark artifact would be explosive. Avada forced a bitter smile. He hadn't wanted to terrify Baron, so he had downplayed it. But it was more than just a dark object. He looked at the depthless void inside the crystal, at the restless golden swirl of mental energy and the complex, eerily familiar magical architecture woven around it. It was a Horcrux, Professor Baker's Horcrux. If true, it meant that the man all the students trusted had committed murder and researched the dark arts for years. From a semester of study, the memories of the original story in his head, and his own research into mental energies, Avada knew a Horcrux wasn't something made casually. Only a wizard consumed by dark magic, who had split his soul through killing, could create one. If souls split that easily, then Aurors and members of the Order would be full of holes from battle. That didn't fit. No wonder he'd felt that dissonance about Baker's mental signature before. Perhaps his soul had already been split, and he'd hidden the oddness somehow. How can you tell it's a dark artifact? Baron asked after a moment, still uncertain. He'd been watching the orb and seen no obvious signs. Get back, now. Avada's voice was deadly serious. Leave the room of requirement and fetch the nearest professor. Flitwick's office is on the 8th floor, right? Come with me to find him, and then I'll get to the headmaster's office. Don't let Professor Baker wake up before we do. Even if you don't trust me, you should trust Professor Flitwick. Avada's urgency finally made Baron understand the gravity of the situation. He nodded. Okay, let's go together. Before Baron could finish, they heard a faint groan. Professor Baker's eyes opened, and he pushed himself up slowly, supporting himself with trembling hands. Run! Both boys panicked and sprinted for the door, but an impossible thing happened. No matter how fast they ran, the door stayed the same distance away. The corridor ahead stretched and twisted, and the path never got any closer. To Avada's senses, the room's spatial magic had been contorted into a labyrinth, an invisible maze that ate distance. It's over, he whispered, stopping and drawing his wand, ready to fight to the bitter end. Baron was pale beside him, similarly poised, and a bitter, helpless amusement crossed Avada's face at how hubris had caught them now. He remembered, with an ironic twist, the confidence he'd had at the start of term. I can't possibly not survive the first semester, right? Professor Baker stood unsteadily now, looking around with a sleepy, hazy expression. Then his eyes fell on Avada and Baron, alarm and confusion wrestling across his face. "You are how here?" His voice was slow and oddly hoarse, as if unused. The boys exchanged glances and felt a surge of hope. Maybe this was their chance. Baron stepped forward, concern replacing fright. "Professor Baker, are you all right? We just came in and found you collapsed." "Merlin, you're awake," Avada blurted, relief flooding him. "We were going to find another professor. His voice faltered. He hadn't intended to reveal anything. Baker looked at his hands in puzzlement. After a long moment, he stared at them and said, slowly, "Yes, I'm awake. You are." Recognition creased his face. "That's right. You're Avada Kedavra and Baron Shafiq, my students. I am Benjamin Baker, Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts, an adventurer, and a member of the Black Magic Defense League's board." He clutched his head, swaying. "The way to speak to students, yes." He forced a stiff smile. "Thank you for your concern. I'm fine. It was a small accident, nothing to worry about. You two continue on with your play. I have work to do." As he finished, the warped space snapped back to normal. Baker took a shaky step and walked out, closing the door behind him. Avada and Baron stood staring at each other in stunned silence. "What just happened?" Baron finally breathed. He sank down, exhausted, then his face hardened as he replayed Baker's odd condition. Avada did not speak. Inside, he suspected this was the aftermath of a completely split soul. Baker's mental energy had been greatly diminished. The familiar, central void that marked a living mind was shrunken. "Oh, right." Baron turned to Avada, curiosity bubbling up. "Didn't Professor Baker just say your real name? You're Ava. Don't say it out loud." Avada shivered. "I'll explain later. For now, go find Professor Flitwick. I'll go straight to the headmaster. Baker's state is beyond a regular professor. We need Dumbledore." Baron nodded. He understood enough not to press. They started toward the door together, wands at the ready, when an urgent, familiar voice called after them. "Mr. Kedavra! Mr. Shafiq! Don't leave! Wait, please!" They both spun around, hearts racing, only to see the room of requirement as it normally was. Nothing amiss. "I am here." The voice spoke with a wry smile. "Step forward. Look down at your feet. That black crystal ball." Only then did Avada and Baron realize, in their panic, they had been so focused on the professor that they'd forgotten about the black crystal ball, an object they suspected was tied to the dark arts, and the voice coming from it was Professor Baker's. Avada and Baron drew their wands again, but neither of them dared approach the crystal ball that had rolled to a stop on the floor. "Being cautious about the unknown is sensible," Professor Baker's voice sighed. "But I really didn't mean to do anything to you. You must have noticed how strange the me with a body was earlier, yes? That was a fake. I am the real Benjamin Baker." "You are the real Professor Baker?" Baron blurted. They exchanged a baffled look. Even Avada, who knew about Horcruxes, found the idea hard to accept. A fragment of a soul in the body, while the main consciousness was locked away in a Horcrux. What method could produce that? What else might be true about Professor Baker? Avada pulled Baron back a few paces and edged toward the room's door. "Sorry, Professor Baker, your situation is complicated. We're only first years. We can't verify or help with this. We'll go find Professor Dumbledore and get you proper help." "Please, absolutely not." Baker's voice turned urgent, and the space inside the room of requirement seemed to twist again. The door tightened into an inescapable, invisible maze. "My current state absolutely cannot be known by others. I can swear to you," the voice continued in a lower tone, "that the reason I am like this is not because I wanted to harm anyone or because I've been doing evil. But everyone has secrets they don't want exposed, don't they? For example, you, Avada. On what did you base your certainty that this crystal ball is a dark arts object? Would you be willing to tell that to anyone else?" Avada stiffened, frowning. Baron's expression hardened into suspicion. "So this crystal ball really is a dark arts object?" he asked. "That depends on how you define the dark arts," Professor Baker replied with a rueful smile. "If you mean the academic definition, magic that requires damage to the user's own mind, then yes, this crystal ball belongs to the dark arts, and it might be one of the darkest such creations. But if you're using the older moral definition, that only magic used for evil qualifies as dark arts, then rest assured, this crystal ball has no connection to evil." Avada, listening intently, felt a sudden spark of recognition through his magic senses. Before he could voice it, Baron frowned. I'm confused, Professor Baker. Explain exactly what happened. As director of the League for the Defense Against the Dark Arts, why do you possess something so dangerous? Why bring it to Hogwarts? What was it for? Why is your body occupied by another consciousness, and why did your main self end up in the crystal ball? If you didn't want anyone to know, what would you have done if we hadn't come? The crystal ball was silent for a long moment. It seems if I don't clear this up, you won't help me, Baker said with a helpless sigh. All right, I'll give you a rough explanation. Avada raised an eyebrow and fell quiet. There was nowhere to run. Let's say this plainly. The me inside the crystal ball now, and the person who walked out just now and controls my body, are both Benjamin Baker. For reasons I'm still not certain of, during my travels, my consciousness split. The split severely impaired my thinking, my control over my body, and my spellcasting. I spent years searching for a solution and finally devised a plan. Create a special container to absorb the split fragment so my main consciousness could fully control my body again. That black crystal ball is the container I made to hold that fragment. There was wariness in his voice. To build it, I had to gather knowledge and magical materials from everywhere. It's also why I came to Hogwarts as a professor. The library here is the largest in Britain. The restricted section contains secrets I needed, and there's a hidden place I learned of as a student, right here. I thought this place might help me succeed more quickly. It proved the right decision. The library and the restricted section gave me essential knowledge, and being on staff helped me obtain rare materials. A few days ago, I finally finished the container. I came to the room of requirement to perform the transference in secret, and I even cast charms on the room to keep students out. That's why you couldn't open the door before. Oh, right, Baron said, but we've opened this room before. Let me finish. The voice turned rueful. But as I began the ritual, the container, being more effective than I anticipated, and an error in my procedure caused the opposite of what I intended. My main consciousness was drawn into the container, and the fragment remained in my body and took control. Avada's expression went blank for a moment. It really was like putting the main soul into a Horcrux, an astonishingly backwards result. How could someone create such a thing? And yet here was Baker, explaining it plainly. That's also why you could open other rooms, Baker went on. The room of requirement judges whether something is a person based on the completeness of the consciousness inside. My main consciousness is trapped in the container, and the fragment in my body is too small to be recognized as a person. So, in the room's eyes, I shifted from a person to two objects. Avada nodded inwardly. That fitted. Voldemort's Horcrux in the room of requirement had not stopped students from accessing other rooms either. The me in the body will prove my point in time, Baker said softly. You'll find his lessons growing dull and rigid. His reactions will be slower than they used to be. Baron interrupted, suspicion plain in his voice. If that's true, why didn't you get help? Why trap us when we wanted to find Dumbledore? I said I would explain. Baker's voice went low. Although the crystal ball is not evil, it is a cutting-edge dark arts creation. If word of it got out, regardless of my reasons, it would ruin my reputation. Moreover, the crystal ball contains a great deal of my unique techniques and safeguards. If it fell into the wrong hands and those methods were analyzed, it would be catastrophic for me, an adventurer who has made countless enemies among dark wizards. I do need help, he finished, but I want as few people involved as possible. 24. Lies and contracts. Professor Baker hid the real reason he had created the Horcrux. Avada's magical sense let him intuit the most fundamental shifts in other people's spiritual power. He could perceive their true emotions and thoughts almost directly. It was like a simple legilimency that left no trace and ignored occlumency. Kindness or malice, sincerity or hypocrisy, joy or anger, lies and concealments meant nothing to him. Most of what Professor Baker said had been true. Only at the very beginning, when he explained why he had made the crystal ball, had Avada noticed a subtle concealment in his spiritual signature. Of course, Baker couldn't come out and say it. Who would help a man who openly admitted committing murder in pursuit of immortality? And the fact that he had asked two first-year students for help rather than a fellow professor suggested he did not want the Horcrux's nature uncovered. He had also carefully avoided the word soul, repeatedly using consciousness and speaking of its properties instead. There was one thing, however, that bothered Avada. When Professor Baker swore he had not done evil, when he answered Baron's question, "Is the crystal ball a dark arts item?" he was telling the truth. In other words, Baker was indeed highly proficient in the dark arts. The black crystal ball really was a Horcrux, and the reason for creating it was unspeakable, but Baker had not done evil in creating it? That contradicted everything Avada thought he knew. Still, he reminded himself he'd only encountered magic for a few months. His understanding of that world was shallow. Maybe there was a way to make a Horcrux without the soul becoming corroded by the dark arts that he didn't know about. Or perhaps Baker had split his soul after killing a truly monstrous dark wizard. There might be subtleties Avada couldn't see. "You want us to help you?" Baron asked, frowning. "We're just first years. How could we solve this?" "Don't worry," Baker said. "Even a first year needn't be particularly gifted. Helping me won't be difficult or dangerous, provided you're not foolish. I've taught you both for half a year. I can sense that your levels are well above your peers. If you do help, I'll reward you handsomely. Money, some of my unique skills, secret intelligence, potion recipes. I'll also teach you methods directly, and do everything I can to guide you and control the risks." He suddenly gave a wry smile. "But you don't seem inclined to trust me from the start, especially you, Mr. Ken." Avada's pupils tightened. "As an adventurer who deals with dark wizards, I have an eye for subtle tells." Professor Baker sounded almost helpless. Besides, a wizard who speaks of mastery of the dark arts brings a cutting-edge dark arts object into a school and hides behind a friendly face. Doesn't that make him suspicious? "Still," he added, "since I dare to ask, I have a way to earn your trust. Mr. Shafiq," he continued, turning to Baron, "you're a direct descendant of the Shafiq family, one of the sacred 28, aren't you?" Baron met his gaze warily. "So what?" Professor Baker's tone softened with a hint of a smile. "As an old pure-blood family, you must have a mental imprint contract, yes?" Baron's expression shifted from guarded to thoughtful. "A mental imprint contract? What's that?" Avada asked. He had never heard the term. "It's a magical contract that doesn't use a wand signature," Baron explained, "but requires a mark made with spiritual power to sign. It's a more advanced contract used by powerful wizards. Their control of magic is so precise that wand signatures can be tampered with. A spiritual imprint is more reliable." "And it suits my situation," Professor Baker said easily. "I don't have a body now. Even if I wanted to sign with a wand, I can't. I can only use a mental imprint contract. If I'm willing to bind myself with a magical contract to guarantee what I've said and restrain my actions, would you trust me?" Avada and Baron exchanged looks and considered the offer. Baker added almost casually, "There's an easier way I could have used. I'm manipulating the room's spatial magic now. I could have trapped you and forced an unbreakable vow, but I didn't want to. I prefer cooperation based on mutual trust rather than one-sided coercion, especially with my students." As he finished, Avada felt the room's chaotic spatial hum quiet. Baker's voice lingered in his head. "All right, I've lifted the spatial magic. You're free to leave." "I won't imprison you, but I have one request," Baker said. "If you agree to sign a contract with me, don't tell anyone else about my affairs." "Just a request?" Baron asked. "What if we refuse?" "I've shown my sincerity," Baker replied with a sigh. "If that can't buy even a little trust, then it's my fault." He paused. "After the Christmas holiday, I will await your reply." Then his voice was gone. The black crystal ball rolled quietly across the floor and settled among the other items in the room of requirement, unremarkable among the clutter. No one would suspect the soul of a powerful wizard rested inside such an ordinary object. Avada and Baron stared at the ball, then edged toward the door. When they reached it, Baron yanked it open, and both of them bolted out, slamming it shut. The door slid away to show only bare stone, and the two of them collapsed to the floor, pale and trembling, sweat beading on their foreheads as they drew ragged breaths. The encounter had been intense and mentally draining. Facing a whole-life wizard whose motives were unclear felt like walking a tightrope on a cliff. One misstep could be fatal. It took them a long time to recover. Few people stayed at Hogwarts during the Christmas break. Hardly anyone ever came up to the 8th floor. Professor Flitwick was probably still asleep, so no one noticed them. "Do you intend to trust him?" Avada asked at last. Avada found himself inclined to give Professor Baker a measure of trust. His perception of spiritual shifts had told him Baker's kindness and sincerity were genuine. Baker could have trapped them and forced an unbreakable vow, and yet he hadn't. If they could get a contract to bind him, the risk seemed manageable. But the mental imprint contract belonged to the Shafiq family. If Baron refused, they had no means to restrain Baker. Avada wouldn't dare assist an unbound wizard. 25. Trust and responsibility. Distrust. Baron's decisive answer made Avada pause. He looked up, surprised, and met Baron's resolute gaze. "It's not that I don't want to," Avada began. "It's that I can't. After all, he's been my professor for half a year, and he just showed sincere remorse. Personally, I'm more than willing to trust him." Baron's voice was low. "Choosing to trust him isn't just my decision, or even ours alone. Who's to say Professor Baker was telling the truth? Who knows what his true colors are? And if we agree to help him, might he secretly interfere and lead us into doing something harmful to others? There's no way around it. He's much more powerful than us, and he has plenty of ways to mislead and deceive. Even his suggestion of a contract could be a trap. Maybe he has a way to nullify contracts, which is why he dared propose that condition." Avada smiled bitterly to himself. He could sense where Professor Baker's mind hid, and that allowed him to tentatively trust the fragment that seemed to think for itself. But that was only the result of his peculiar talent for seeing through the essence of others' mental power. He couldn't prove any of it to anyone. As for the loophole Baron worried about, Avada wasn't overly concerned. He'd signed ministry contracts before, and knew that multi-party contracts leave an imprint on a wizard's mental power, a mutual connection. If Professor Baker tried to tamper with that imprint, Avada would feel it. And if the professor had a way to block that sense, would his magical senses simply fail for show? If Avada detected anything amiss, he'd report it to Professor Dumbledore immediately. But Avada also understood Baron's reluctance. No one would willingly place precautions-free trust in a mysterious wizard far stronger than themselves. What if the other party changed their mind halfway through? "So you plan to tell Dumbledore about this?" Baron asked, helplessness in his voice. To be honest, Avada's instincts matched Professor Baker's on that point. He didn't want to involve Dumbledore unless absolutely necessary. Even though Dumbledore, if convinced Professor Baker hadn't done evil, would likely keep the matter quiet, and that might help accelerate Voldemort's downfall, Avada had reasons to hesitate. First, he didn't want Dumbledore to intervene in the Horcrux matter prematurely. Letting him know now could alter the timeline in unpredictable ways, wrecking plans Voldemort had laid out. One of the Horcruxes was the Resurrection Stone, a weapon so dangerous it might make Dumbledore lose control. Avada couldn't trust Dumbledore implicitly in that respect. Second, there was already a lead on a way to target Horcruxes without destroying the objects themselves, and more samples would help research. Following Professor Baker's steps could be a valuable opportunity. Third, and most important, Professor Baker had insisted he had not and would not do evil. That alone was enough for Avada to try to help within limited risk. Legilimency and Veritaserum were useless against a powerful wizard, so they couldn't prove anything. Avada realized he might be the only one able truly to verify Baker's innocence. But the fact remained. Baker had created a Horcrux, and Horcruxes were universally condemned as the blackest form of dark magic. If Professor Baker fell into other wizards' hands, the consequences could be worse than a ruined reputation. That wasn't a fate anyone who hadn't done evil should suffer. "I won't tell anyone else," Avada said. Baron answered suddenly, as if responding to Avada's earlier question. "Huh?" Avada frowned. "I just said I couldn't confirm Professor Baker's words, so I don't dare trust him. But if he truly is innocent, wouldn't our suspicion cause an innocent person undue suffering?" Baron said earnestly. "So what will you do?" "I'll ask the professor for temporary leave from Hogwarts," Avada said. "Once I'm home, I'll examine whether there's any loophole in the mental imprint contract. If there is, I'll tell the professors everything. If there isn't, Baron finished for him, I'll have my house elf help me secretly draft the most comprehensive contract possible so Professor Baker can be fully bound without my parents knowing. Then, after Christmas, I'll return to Hogwarts and present it to him. Sounds reasonable, Avada nodded. And if Professor Baker does have an ulterior motive, if he intended to exploit a loophole in the contract but, faced with an airtight one, decides to trap me, forcing me into an unbreakable vow, or attacking me with something hidden, then I'll leave a note in my dormitory before I go, a full account of the whole thing. If I don't come back within 2 days, it will move to a prominent place and open automatically. Baron smiled with quiet confidence. You're planning to shoulder all the risk yourself? Avada noticed Baron's choice of I just then and frowned. This is my responsibility. My responsibility? You're only a first year. I'm a pureblood and I'm a Slytherin. Protecting the wizarding world, protecting wizards, protecting the innocent, that's part of my duty. Maybe in other times I could leave such matters to those stronger than me, but now, if I pass this on, an innocent might suffer. I can't accept that. If Professor Baker is innocent and his requests are reasonable, I should do everything I can to help him. Not just him, anyone. That's the responsibility that comes with the wealth and position my family enjoys. Avada fell silent for a long moment. He could have told Baron that his first duty should be to himself, to look after those who cared for him and not throw away his safety for others. But Baron's choice fit Avada's plan perfectly. Handle the matter quietly, without dragging Dumbledore into Horcrux affairs now. Looking into Baron's clear, steady eyes, Avada felt a sting of guilt. He was using Baron, in a way. Baron didn't need to be involved. Had he not casually mentioned the room of requirement, Avada would have borne the matter alone. Then at least take me with you, Avada said, a little weakly. I'm involved and I know what's going on. I have the right and the responsibility to share the risk. I can't just stand by and watch my friend put himself in danger. That's easy to say. Baron hesitated, then, his face stern, nodded. Let's go downstairs. Arguing here won't solve anything. You're right. They started toward the stairs. Suddenly, in the same instant, a flash of lightning, 2 first years cast a match of spells that would have made many professors' jaws drop. Avada's wand was in his hand before he knew it. He raised a translucent pale blue barrier and watched through it as Baron reacted. Obliviate, Baron shouted. Protego, Avada countered. Avada had seen Baron's shift in expression and the surge in his mind. How could he not know what Baron intended? Yet he was somewhat surprised that Baron had mastered a memory charm in his first year. You should learn to trust people, Baron said through his own barrier. Avada met his gaze calmly. Not everyone needs your protection, and you can't protect everyone. You're being arrogant. You can't shoulder the risk alone. You need my help. You, Baron studied Avada, serious but with a faint smile in his eyes, and the shimmering blue shield between them. He looked conflicted. Finally, he lowered his wand. All right. He walked past Avada without another word and was the first to descend the stairs. Avada watched his back until he turned the corner, then took one last hard look down the deepest part of the 8th floor corridor before hurrying after him. The headmaster's office at Hogwarts was on the 8th floor. 26. Contract. It was after the Christmas holidays when I met Baron again. During those 10-odd days off, I'd been on edge. The only thing I could do was go to the room of requirement every day to check on Professor Baker and make sure nothing else happened. Finally, Baron returned with a palm-sized scrap of parchment. On it were a few rough clauses, and when I stared at it, I couldn't help asking, "This is the absolutely comprehensive contract you mentioned?" "Oh, that's just the table of contents," Baron said calmly. He tapped the parchment with his wand, and it poofed. The scrap thickened and unfolded and unfolded and unfolded until a sheet the size of a carpet lay spread out in front of me. The tiny, dense print made my head swim. Under my magic senses, the contract's structure was immense and intricate, far more so than the one I'd signed at the Department of Mysteries. Baron explained, "Besides daily chores, my house elves also handle some family matters. They're absolutely loyal. They wouldn't leak secrets. Legilimency and Veritaserum barely work on them. Some of them know a great deal about magical contracts, and under my supervision, there shouldn't be any problems. Read it through and see." "You still have several house elves in your family?" I blurted. I'd assumed noble families kept at most one, Malfoy, Black, and the like. Baron looked puzzled that I asked and pushed the carpet-sized contract toward me, urging me to read. There was no escaping it. I flopped on the floor, turned a quill into a magnifying glass, and began to read word by word. To be airtight, a magic contract often needed to pack everything into a single page. This one was multiple pages worth, all folded into that enormous sheet. It took me hours. By the time I lifted my head, my vision swam and my temples throbbed. The contract constricted Professor Baker's identity, memories, behavior, motivations, everything. Its conditions were brutal. If, since becoming an adventurer, Baker had never intentionally harmed innocents, if the tasks he asked of Baron and me posed no major danger to others and would harm only Professor Baker himself and fake Baker, if he would not threaten, silence, delete, or alter our memories or otherwise harm us after reaching his goal, and so on, then the contract would not harm him. Correspondingly, the contract bound Baron and me. We could not disclose anything the agreement classified as not to be divulged, unless two of the three signatories agreed. We had to do our best to help Professor Baker reach his goal while he was bound, so long as the risks were controllable. Definitions and restrictive conditions filled the entire carpet. No loopholes, no technicalities to exploit. I thought, if something like the Horcrux diary ever showed up, with this contract signed, I'd even be willing to help him possess Lord Voldemort's main body. That thought made my stomach weird, but it showed how ironclad the terms were. When I finished reading that evening, Baron and I went with the contract to the room of requirement and presented it to Professor Baker. Half an hour later, he said quietly, "I've finished reading." His voice sounded tired, his mind a little dull. Very detailed. No, it's too detailed. Even dark wizards who specialize in contract fraud can't usually craft clauses this precise. "But it's reasonable," Baron said. "If you two agree, sign it with me now. You know how to sign a mental imprint contract, yes?" "Of course." We both nodded. Baron had already shown me the method. Professor Baker looked pleased. "Very well. Shall we begin?" Blue starlight shimmered inside a black crystal ball, as though a tiny universe swirled within it. I felt Baker's mind project through the crystal ball toward the parchment, waiting. Baron held his breath and focused on a complex rune etched on the contract. Guided by it, his mind overlapped with Baker's. I followed, projecting my own mind into the same place. The parchment flared. A strange, powerful magic surged from it and flowed into our mental bodies, leaving a nearly imperceptible imprint. The imprint would warn the others if any of us even thought about breaking the contract, and if someone actually violated it, the backlash of that imprint would strike them. For Baron and me, the backlash would be grievous injury. For Professor Baker, it would be lethal. The imprint settled into my mind. I had to admire the mental imprint contract. My senses could not find a simple way to break it. As the light on the parchment faded, the three of us exhaled and visibly relaxed. We were now formally bound and could trust each other. "Since the contract is signed, we can speak openly," Professor Baker said, clearly relieved. "Mr. Ken, Mr. Shafaki, your magic levels are well beyond first year, aren't they? To design the right plan, I need you to show me everything you can do without holding back." Baron answered first. "I've independently mastered all the spells, transfiguration, and defense against the dark arts content through third year. I also know 2 dark arts spells. One is a variation of the freezing charm, and the other can rapidly heal limb injuries, though it causes severe backlash a few hours later." "You know dark arts?" I asked, glancing at him. "My family taught me," he replied simply. "They said it's not safe for me to be out alone." I suspected the Shafaki family had been looking ahead. Most people believed Hogwarts was the safest place in Britain. At least it used to be before Harry Potter's time. "As for me," I said, "I know everything through third year too. I can cast the shield charm, stupefy, confundo, and the impediment jinx. I also have a mind link that lets me communicate directly into someone else's thoughts." "Excellent," Professor Baker beamed. "Your strength exceeds my expectations. That means the other me will be far less vigilant around you two, which gives us many opportunities. Fortunately, you were the ones who found me," he added more quietly. "If it had been other, older wizards who weren't powerful, I might have had to work much harder." Now I will explain my plan, he continued. If you have questions, raise them. I can adjust things according to your needs. You've already given me a great deal of leeway. First thing I can confirm, my other self doesn't know about me or the existence of this crystal ball. I deliberately shielded that fragment of consciousness when I made the ball, so he has no memory of it. That creates a natural information asymmetry. However, aside from that, he has almost all of my memories and personality. Because he's only a fragment, his mental power is far weaker than my main body's, so reading memories will be slow, controlling the body clumsy, and casting spells even worse. His combat ability probably isn't even as good as an ordinary auror. What you need to do is help me set up a consciousness extraction enchantment in this room, then lure my other self here, defeat him until he can no longer resist, and finally, using the enchantment we prepared, let me return to my body. Avada was a little surprised. Even after being weakened so severely, Professor Baker's remaining power still matched an auror's. Don't underestimate aurors just because of appearances. They're the most skilled and resilient wizards, selected through the harshest screening, the true elite combat force of the magical world. You might think 2 first years taking on an auror is absurd, Avada said, but that's not actually the case. Professor Baker continued, his vigilance toward you is almost nil, and I know all his combat habits and weaknesses. We'll be prepared while he's not, so we can set traps in advance. With this spatial magic under my control, with your skill, defeating him will be no problem. At the same time, outside of the time spent setting up the magic, I'll personally teach you combat techniques and some spells tailored to my style and weaknesses. You must keep these techniques secret. They concern my life. No problem. Avada and Baron nodded together. Very good. Baker tried to nod back, but finding he had no body, could only continue helplessly. I'll first teach you how to lay the consciousness extraction enchantment. It might be a bit difficult, and there are a lot of magical materials you'll need to gather. Setting up this one enchantment will probably take until February or March. That's fine. The time will let you train properly. Shall we start now? Did you bring notebooks? Avada and Baron exchanged looks, and after confirming with their eyes, both shook their heads. They'd only come to sign a contract and hadn't expected Baker to move so fast. All right, then let's start tomorrow. You can come for instruction at any time, but be discreet and don't let others notice anything strange. It's best if both of you come together, otherwise I'll have to explain the same material twice, and that's a waste of time. Okay, that's all for today. Remember to bring notebooks and pens tomorrow. What I'm going to teach is much more complex than first-year coursework. It's a good thing those classes aren't too demanding for you. The black crystal ball went dark. Avada and Baron left the room of requirement. When should we come tomorrow? Baron asked as they walked down the stairs. After dinner, I suppose, Avada replied. Baron paused to think, then said, from now on, after dinner we shouldn't meet up together. Each of us should go to the room separately. That reduces the chance of being noticed. If one of us has astronomy, the other can go find Professor Baker and tell him the lesson's canceled. There are only 2 astronomy classes a week anyway, so it won't slow things down much. As for the weekend, Avada followed Baron's train of thought. We can't spend every weekend in the room. We should spend some time in our houses so it's not suspicious. Hufflepuffs have our traditional picnics. Then we'll go once on Saturday night, and for half a day on Sunday, morning or afternoon we'll decide Saturday. Baron clapped his hands, and together they finalized the plan. Oh, by the way, I kept meaning to ask, what's the story behind your name? With their immediate worries sorted, Baron's curiosity stirred. He recalled the fragment of consciousness saying Avada's true name at Christmas. Avada paled, instinctively wanting to dodge the question, but he knew that someone who knew his true name without understanding its meaning could be dangerous. If someone cast the killing curse at him, he might die thinking, you know Avada too? Besides, Baron was a friend who'd shared hardship with him. There was no reason to hide it. Have you heard of the unforgivable curses? Avada asked. Of course, Crucio, Imperio, and the killing curse. My name is the incantation for the killing curse. Baron was speechless. Avada sighed and briefly explained the Department of Mystery's outrageous experiment. Baron's face changed several times as he listened. In the end, he didn't know what to say. He patted Avada's shoulder wordlessly. Whether that was encouragement or condolence was unclear, then went on toward the Slytherin common room. Avada watched him go, hesitated, and started up the stairs. He stopped, then shook his head and headed to the Hufflepuff common room. He had considered going back to the room of requirement after Baron left to confront Professor Baker directly about the Horcrux and force the truth out. After all, the contract bound them, so Baker couldn't do anything to him. At worst, the professor would be shocked that a first-year knew about top-tier dark arts like Horcruxes. Professor Baker raised many questions. In Avada's understanding, soul referred to mental power. In the study of mental power, Avada was an expert. His talent optimization work alone could earn a Merlin first-class order. Yet he had never found any structure in mental power that could explain splitting by killing. At first, he'd suspected that when mental power was corrupted by dark arts, it might form new structures, and only the most evil dark wizards could split their souls through killing. Baker had shattered that view. Although there were traces of dark corruption in his mental power, there was none of the structure Avada had imagined. Baker's soul had been split, and he had made a Horcrux, and since a person can make multiple Horcruxes, the splitting structure shouldn't simply disappear after the split. Every sign pointed to a single unsettling fact. Creating a Horcrux, at least the act of splitting a soul, was more complex than Avada had assumed. What exactly was the relationship between killing and splitting? Under what conditions could someone split their soul, and how did it work? Why was there a magical void at the center of mental power? Why did that void split when the mental power split? If Professor Baker were willing to answer, Avada could gain invaluable knowledge for free. His understanding of mental power and research on Horcruxes would leap forward, and he could perhaps determine the true process by which Baker created his Horcrux. If the only condition for splitting was simply killing, with no requirement on the soul itself, then Baker's creation would be less surprising. He was a renowned dark wizard hunter. If he'd sacrificed a few wholly evil people to create Horcruxes, he might have thought it justified. Even if Baker refused to answer, it wouldn't necessarily matter. Avada didn't want the Horcrux matter exposed, so why would Baker tell others that a first year knew about Horcruxes? But after careful thought, Avada abandoned the tempting idea of confronting Baker immediately. Letting others know of his interest in Horcruxes was far too risky. Chapter 28, Disillusionment Curse. For the next few days, the school buzzed with gossip about the once-respected Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Have you had Professor Baker's class yet? I have. Did you notice something off? Yes. He seems listless, talks so slowly, and his voice is so flat now. He used to be brilliant, full of extra tips and stories from his own adventures. You didn't want to leave his lessons. Now it's just textbook droning, even if the detail is good. How could someone that good change in only 10 days? Let's go visit him. Maybe dessert and milk tea will cheer him up. People already went. Even Professor McGonagall visited. Nothing helped. That's because Professor Snape was jealous of Baker and drugged his food, one rumor claimed. Someone said Professor Binns got bored of history of magic and possessed Baker, another offered. Or it's Voldemort's curse sneaking in. Wait, what does possession actually mean? No amount of rumor mattered to Avada and Baron. They were holed up in the room of requirement, practicing relentlessly. The room of hidden things had been tidied and rearranged so that clutter was pushed into corners or used as cover. A large open space had been cleared in the center, where the two of them stood, wands raised and throwing off weird streaks of light as they chanted long, complicated incantations. After an unknown stretch of time, they lowered their wands together, breathed out, and felt the sweep of exhaustion. Very good. The voice of Professor Baker came from a black crystal ball tucked among the clutter. With that, the second part of the magic is complete. Your pace of learning is faster than I expected, the voice continued. At this rate, you'll finish the enchantment layout by mid-February. Take a break, then we'll start today's lesson. Merlin, my head feels like it's going to explode. Baron sat on the floor, hands to his temples. Though he was one of the most capable first years in general, Professor Baker's demands were enormous. The spell to extract consciousness alone broke down into 7 stages. Each stage required days of study and more time to set up. On top of that, they had to devise strategies to bait fake Baker, set traps, brew potions, master curses, and keep up their combat training. They still had daytime classes and nightly homework. Avada's situation was worse. Without a living instructor to demonstrate techniques, his magical senses were of limited use. Even with his accelerated talent, he lagged behind Baron and had been returning to the dorm barely conscious each night, collapsing as soon as his head hit the pillow. Shaby, Summers, and Stebbins worried for him. He couldn't tell them the truth, so he only trained harder to finish sooner and relieve their concern. The strain showed in the lines around his eyes. During the drills, a worrying thought had taken root in Avada. What if next year Voldemort possessed Quirrell and slipped into Hogwarts? Would Professor Baker's protections work against that? He kept that to himself, and with a bitter face, raised his wand again when Baker spoke. Today we're going to learn the disillusionment charm. It plays a significant role in the plan, for acquiring materials, and in the final fight. You must master it. Don't worry, the disillusionment charm is simpler than some of the spells you've attacked already. Fewer people master it because its effect is unusual and tightly regulated by the Ministry. Normally, only aurors or other specialized professions are allowed to learn it. The spell itself is probably at a 3rd or 4th year level, Baker said, but the real difficulty is mastering its use. The disillusionment charm works by altering the apparent color and texture of your body so you blend with your surroundings. A clumsy disillusionment will just turn you into a patchwork of wrong colors and can make you stand out even more. Avada raised his hand. He'd wondered about this since reading stories. If it only changes surface color, how does it make someone completely invisible? Suppose I stand in a room with a black floor and white walls and use the charm. If I match the walls, won't I be obvious from above? Baron, standing beside him, froze and then looked to the crystal ball with the same puzzled expression. Very sharp. You hit the heart of the problem. That's why we don't just teach the incantation, Professor Baker said approvingly. Mastering technique is the primary goal here. Users of the disillusionment charm usually maximize invisibility by changing their position, hugging the walls, crawling, avoiding exposure to multiple vantage points. Remember, it only grants visual concealment. You'll also need training in sense suppression, tracking avoidance, stealth, and related skills. Avada listened, conflicted between excitement and exhaustion. Professor Baker continued, I had thought about keeping this heavy training a secret so you wouldn't be discouraged, but you can handle it. Is there no magic that makes someone entirely invisible in one go? Baron asked, half desperate. Don't even think about it, the crystal ball's voice replied with a hint of helplessness. Not unless you have an invisibility cloak woven from Demoguy's hair. And the Demoguy's method of invisibility is still a mystery. If anyone could decipher it and create a truly complete invisibility spell, the Department of Mysteries and the Auror Office would fight over you. So focus on the practical training. That's the right path. Avada couldn't help a private regret. If he could get his hands on a demiguise, he was sure he could figure out full invisibility in a few days and scare Professor Baker silly. Unfortunately, he couldn't requisition a living demiguise. Not even through his acquaintance with Rolf Scamander, a 4th year. So he set that grand plan aside and, with a grimace, joined Baron in practicing the disillusionment charm once more. As Professor Baker had said, casting the disillusionment charm by itself wasn't difficult. Baron managed his first attempt within half an hour, though at first it left him looking like a chaotic smear of colors. Avada, who had been watching the spell's structure with hungry curiosity, caught on quickly. Once he succeeded, he improved rapidly and soon blended into his surroundings. Baron, after several days of practice, had come to expect Avada's pattern of learning, slow to start, then accelerating. So when, with Baker's guidance and Avada's real-time corrections through their magical link, Baron's own skill began to improve quickly, it wasn't surprising. In short order, Baron reached the standard Professor Baker required. Their method of working, Baron learning first and demonstrating, Avada refining the technique and feeding the improvements back was awkwardly effective, like pulling oneself up by leaning on the other's shoulder. Their close cooperation had once earned Professor Baker unreserved praise. But as Baker had warned, mastering the disillusionment charm was only the beginning. Once Baron's charm met the standard, they moved on to the supporting skills. Silent walking, removing footprints, masking scent, using obstacles, vision-blocking tactics, a whole suite of tactical movements. If they hadn't been first years, Baker might have taught them silent spells too. Magic could teach magic with the help of magical senses, but there were no real shortcuts for physical training, especially for Avada, whose athleticism was only average. Professor Baker slowed the pace of instruction to accommodate him, but Avada still felt the strain. When that strain finally translated into practical ability, however, the pressure seemed small by comparison. Earlier, when Baker first had them perfect the disillusionment charm, he'd said it would be invaluable for acquiring magical materials. At the time, Avada hadn't understood what he meant. Now the meaning was clear. "Someone's coming. Use the disillusionment charm, quick," Baron whispered. "Got it. Hidden," Avada answered. "Yo, Ken, you're here too," a voice called. "Cedric, looking for Professor Baker?" Another voice replied. "Oh, there's a passage in the textbook I don't quite get. Did you just see him?" "I wish. He isn't in. I'm waiting here. What's the point? I've pretty much worked through the second-year Defense Against the Dark Arts book. Maybe I can help." "Thanks. I'll show you. We can go over it." Shouldn't be hard. It's probably this. "Ken, the protective wards are down. Go in." "All right, nope, I don't get it either. Sorry, bit of a cocky move. Didn't mean to waste your time." "No worries. It's impressive you've self-studied second year. I'm off to the library again. See you tonight." "See you." After they were sure Cedric and Ken had gone, Avada slipped into the disillusionment charm, pressed to the wall, and darted silently around the corner to the Defense Against the Dark Arts office. The door, which should have been shut, stood slightly ajar. A faint patch of color near the frame gave the impression something was off. Avada and Baron were in. It was mid-February, and the setup for the mind extraction magic was at its final stage. They had run into a new problem. The last step couldn't be completed by spells alone. It required specific magical ingredients, items that were either dangerous and forbidden or so rare and expensive that even Baron would stare at the price. When they'd asked Professor Baker what to do, he'd anticipated the issue. Some of the needed materials could be found in the Forbidden Forest. Others were kept in his office. Armed with Baker's Forbidden Forest Creature and Herb Distribution Map and the Defense Against the Dark Arts Office Exploration Guide, the two first years had gone out into the forest, gathered herbs, and even worked together to collect acromantula venom. They'd had one mishap. Their activity happened to fall on Hagrid's patrol route. Avada had broken the disillusionment charm and pretended to be a reckless first year out alone, and Hagrid had caught him. Avada's knowledge of magical creatures and his way with people turned the capture into a long but pleasant conversation about hippogriff habits. Hagrid didn't report him to Professor Sprout, only scolded him verbally and warned him to stay out of the Forbidden Forest. Infiltrating Baker's office, by contrast, was the safer part. The space had been arranged by the professor himself and came with the most detailed documentation. Fake Baker's routine matched the real professor's well enough that they knew when he would leave, how long he would be gone, and how carefully he inspected the room upon return. The only problem was the door's wards and alarms. Breaking them required time, and students would inevitably pass by. One of them had to stand guard outside and keep constant contact through their mental link. Because Hufflepuff students were generally more visible than Slytherins, and because Avada's magic sense made the wards easier to dismantle, he chose to be the lookout. Baron did the disarming. Once Baron had neutralized the protections, they widened the gap in the door and slipped inside, closing it silently behind them. They began searching, following Baker's map. "Some of the materials are scraps used in crystal balls," Avada said. "They're hidden in a shielded section. Fake Baker doesn't even know where they are." Working the soles of his shoes with a minor charm, Avada crouched and counted the floorboards. He tapped a rhythm with his wand, One board slid up to reveal a secret compartment filled with bottles and jars. "These can be taken without hesitation," he murmured. He took off his robe and used it as a bundle, packing the concealed materials inside. Later, he would cast disillusionment on the robe itself, and the package would be indistinguishable. "Another portion's in a normal cabinet," Baron said, slipping on protective gloves and opening drawers with careful fingers. "If we grab it carelessly, it'll leave traces. Do you have the fake replacements?" "Of course." Avada checked the list against the items Baron produced and stashed the counterfeit pieces at the very bottom where the absence would be less noticeable. "How much time do we have?" Baron asked. Avada looked at his muggle watch and sent the time over the mental link. 12 minutes until Fake Baker's earliest estimated return. "We should leave room for contingencies. Clearing traces will take time. Move faster." "Understood." They quickened their pace. Baron rifled through the storage with practiced hands while Avada ticked off items on the list. Minutes passed, and at last the collection was complete. They went over the room methodically, removing any sign of intrusion. When Avada confirmed through magic sense that no one lingered outside, he cast the disillusionment charm on himself and then on the large bundle he was carrying. He opened the door and slipped out. Baron followed close behind. Their method of bypassing the door's safety relied on skillful disassembly rather than brute force, so there would be no telltale signs to give them away. 30. Final preparations. After checking that no one would pass by, the two boys, still under a disillusionment charm, silently summoned the door to the room of requirement, slipped inside the storage room, and dispelled their disguises. Phew! As the familiar scene came into view, Avada and Baron both let out relieved breaths. They were capable, had a meticulous plan, and had experience sneaking into the Forbidden Forest, but this was their first time breaking into a professor's office. It was only natural to be nervous. If they were caught, losing 100 house points would be the mildest punishment. Judged more harshly, they could even face Azkaban. "With this one experience, I think we've learned more than all the Gryffindors in the whole school," Baron complained, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's just your prejudice against Gryffindor," Avada said solemnly. "All right, gossiping about people behind their backs is bad manners, but who says Gryffindors can't successfully sneak into a professor's office?" "Ah!" Avada meant to finish seriously, but couldn't keep a straight face. Baron laughed too, until an awkward cough cut through them. I'm from Gryffindor." Professor Baker's faint voice came from the black crystal ball. "Ahem, Professor Baker, the things you asked for have been brought back." Avada quickly set 2 large bundles, wrapped in wizard robes, before the crystal ball and opened them. A dazzling array of bottles and jars gleamed inside. To be honest, his earlier jab about Gryffindor wasn't entirely wrong. Who had taken the African tree snakeskin from Snape's office? "Well done. Thank you both." Professor Baker's voice softened. "However, those fake materials will only hide the truth for a while. If it's drawn out too long, my consciousness fragments will notice something wrong and grow suspicious, which means we don't have much time left." Avada and Baron stiffened. "Luckily," Baker continued, "your excellent work these past months has accelerated everything. The consciousness magic has reached its final step and can be completed tonight. The combat traps and mechanisms are set up, and your fighting abilities have increased rapidly. To be honest, I'm not worried about this operation's success. It's also thanks to your willingness to trust me that I can regain freedom from that failed experiment. I can't imagine being trapped alone in that container, unable to move or speak. I'd have gone mad. You owe me your life." "You don't have to say that, Professor." Baron shook his head. "Helping others is my responsibility as a pureblood." Avada smiled at Baron's statement but remained silent. "All right, let's not talk about that yet," Professor Baker said, a note of amusement in his voice. "Before things are settled, it's best not to discuss what comes after. Tempting fate invites trouble. So let's finish the final step first." Avada and Baron nodded. They placed the magical materials exactly where they belonged, drew their wands, pointed them at the ceiling, and began to chant long, obscure incantations. Their wands weaved complex, beautiful trajectories as the objects reacted. Some glowed, some emitted strange sounds, and others evaporated into thin air. The room of requirement became like a dream garden, streams of colored light dancing and intertwining, forming fleeting, mesmerizing patterns. In their magical senses, the structures built in the previous 6 steps began to converge under the influence of the 7th. The room's magic trembled violently, threatening the room of requirement's very fabric. The new magic gradually eased the turbulence, flowing like water to guide the 6 structures toward fusion. At last, with a resonant sound that belonged to the magical world alone, the 6 structures merged into one, massive, complex, magnificent, and painfully beautiful. It almost made Avada lose himself. It seemed related to mind magic, but far beyond that, less like a soul-splitting Horcrux and more like its opposite. Where Horcrux magic felt chaotic and monstrous to him, this new structure was orderly and astonishingly elegant. "Is this really your magic, Professor Baker?" he murmured, dazed. "I never said that," replied Baker cheerfully. "How could I alone create something so complex? It's the crystallization of countless generations' efforts and wisdom. I'm only a latecomer, sifting those crystals from the dust of history and piecing them together. Does it have a name?" Not yet. Professor Baker considered for a moment. "But if I were to name it, why not call it Confession?" Confession! Baron was curious about the choice of name, but Avada felt as if he'd been struck by lightning. In the original work, confession was the only way to reunite fractured souls. Professor Baker actually named this magic confession. Did that mean it not only extracted souls but could forcibly restore shattered souls, nullifying Horcruxes completely? If so, all right, it's late. You two should go back, Baker said. Rest for a few days, recover, and prepare for the final battle. Relax. Don't put too much pressure on yourselves. For you, defeating the other me is the easiest part of what you've spent months preparing for. Think about the arrangements you've made, the weaknesses I told you, and this spatial magic. If Professor Dumbledore showed up unprepared, you could give him quite a surprise. Avada almost choked. An arrangement that might take down an on of 4 was reduced to a mere surprise against Dumbledore. "Let's set the operation for this Sunday," Baker went on. "You'll have 3 days to rest. That should be short enough for fake Baker not to notice anything amiss." Baron clapped his hands and looked to Avada. "No problem," Avada replied. 31. The showdown begins. Professor Baker! Professor Baker! At 6 on a Sunday morning, just as dawn was paling the sky, a frantic pounding woke Professor Baker. He'd been sleeping deeply, worn out and dragging lately, and the knock snapped him upright. What on earth? He rubbed his eyes, swung his legs out of bed, and in one smooth motion transfigured his pajamas into formal clothes. The teachers' accommodations were attached to their offices, with private rooms tucked behind the public office area. He hurried to his office door and pulled it open. Baron Shafiq stood there, face white with panic. The first-year Slytherin had made an impression on Baker with his aptitude and sharp mind. "What is it, Baron? Slow down and tell me everything," Baker said, keeping his voice calm to stop the student from spiraling. Baron's words tumbled out in a rush, trembling with a sob. "My friend, Ken, he was sucked into a black crystal ball. It happened right in front of me." "What happened exactly?" Baker asked, already moving. "We found a secret room on the 8th floor," Baron blurted. "There were all sorts of strange magical objects. We only meant to look around, but when Ken picked up this black crystal ball, he was just sucked in, like water stretching and then gone. The crystal ball is incredibly heavy. I couldn't lift it. Professor Flitwick's door won't open. Please, please save Ken." Baker felt a stab of alarm, then forced himself to think. "Take me there now," he said. He kept his tone steady. "Don't panic. That sort of object might be enchanted with an undetectable extension charm. Things like that can trap someone inside a pocket space. Real dark arts artifacts almost never get into Hogwarts, so your friend is most likely trapped, not destroyed. We can get him out." They ran. Baron led him up the stairs to the 8th floor and hurriedly paced back and forth in front of a stretch of blank wall. A smooth doorway shimmered and opened where he walked. "This is it," Baron said. Baker recognized the room immediately. His shoulders eased. "I know this place. The items in here shouldn't be truly dangerous." A nagging sense of familiarity tugged at him, a memory he couldn't place. He pushed it aside. There was work to do. Inside, in the center of the chamber, rested a deep black crystal ball. Baron recoiled, pressed himself close behind Baker. Baker walked forward, drew his wand, and examined it. "Looks like a divination crystal ball. The material's extraordinarily tough." He crouched, set the tip of his wand against the ball, and prepared to probe it with an inspection charm. The moment his wand touched the surface, a wave of nausea and exhaustion rolled through him, as if something had leached his strength. He staggered. "Poison?" he muttered. Before he could react, Baron shouted from behind him, "Expelliarmus!" Combat instincts flared. Baker mustered a last reserve of strength, planted his feet, and vaulted aside in a twisting leap. He just managed to avoid the disarming jinx, and in the same instant, a flash of red light struck him from only a few meters away. The force slammed into his chest, knocked him back, and his wand flew from his hand, only to vanish in midair as if eaten by the air itself. "Another wizard?" Baker barked. His right hand twitched, and another wand slid from inside his sleeve into his palm, an old trick of his. He swung it up to conjure a wall of fire and flush out whatever was hiding, but a white-hot pain stabbed through his skull. Fatigue crept in so fast he nearly blacked out. A mental curse, he realized. Something targeting the mind, aimed at the ground level. Unseen in the gloom, someone had stowed the disarmed wand away. Avada, cloaked under a disillusionment charm, had just slipped it into his cloak. He watched, holding his breath as the scene unfolded. Memories of Baker's lessons, advice he'd given his first-year students, flashed through the fragment's mind like a tape played back. "You are not aurors," he'd warned them. "You lack the stamina and resilience of seasoned fighters. An opponent who wears you down physically and mentally can defeat you without ever landing a killing blow. Poisons and mind-targeting curses are effective unless you prepare an antidote and a counter-curse in advance. They can be detected, true, but that detection can be used against the attacker." He had also described a technique from his adventuring days he called double casting, using two wands at once to cast unrelated spells without interference. To counter that, he'd said, "Your first move should be to disarm my primary wand, knock it away, and prevent me from using both wands. Don't expect to end the fight with a single stupefy. Your raw power won't make me collapse." And when reduced to a disadvantage, he had taught, put distance between yourself and ground-level effects. Use a bubblehead charm to isolate toxins, transfigure ropes to secure the ceiling, swing yourself into the air like an ape, and buy time to heal while gaining the advantage of mobility. The fragment acted on that memory. The sleeve of his robe unfurled and shivered. The fabric transformed into several stout grappling lines that shot up and anchored themselves to the ceiling. The ropes jerked taut and hauled him into the air, carrying him out of reach of the ground-based curse. Swinging with surprising agility, he twisted in midair and mumbled the bubblehead charm. A faint globe shimmered into place around his head, filtering the poisoned air. "Mr. Shafiq, what are you doing? Why did you bring me here?" he demanded, looking down at the boy. Baron stayed low, shaking but silent, mostly firing petty jinxes skyward, useless but frantic. From behind a heap of discarded items, someone began launching stronger spells in rapid succession. The professor used the ropes to arc aside from each salvo. "Expected you," he said coldly. The jinxes were precise and strategic. This wasn't a chaotic ambush. Someone had planned this. "Coerced you into luring me, did you? Hogwarts is easy to infiltrate now," he muttered, fury sharpening his voice. "I'll be reporting this to the headmaster." The hidden attacker never answered. Spell after spell hissed from the shadows, forcing Baker to keep moving, dodging while trying to conserve energy. He watched for any sign of the enemy, eyes narrowing. Rats, he thought, hiding and scratching at the base of the walls. A cruel little smile touched his lips. "If you're going to hide like rats," he said, "I'll have to dig you out." 32. Chain Trap. Listening to fake Baker's righteous words, Avada, still under a disillusionment charm, felt a twinge of sympathy. If he lacked magical senses and didn't know about Horcruxes, he might have truly pitied the fragment of soul before him. But he did know. He knew that Horcruxes like that diary could act and think independently while remaining parts of their original bodies. And his magic senses showed him plainly that the spiritual and magical gaps in Professor Baker's form were incomplete and shared the same origin as the main body trapped in the crystal ball. In short, fake Baker was like an artificial intelligence. acting and reacting from stored memories, but not possessing true selfhood. What he did now likely reflected how the real Professor Baker would behave in the same situation. That made the task clear. Help the real Professor Baker return to his main body. Avada didn't hesitate. He kept moving, using cover and shadows to hide his casting and whispering the most effective spells he could. He didn't mind the rapid drain on his energy. Every gesture and incantation was aimed at diverting and breaking down Fake Baker's defenses. Baron, meanwhile, was doing only token jinxes to keep appearances while Fake Baker attended to him and quietly watched Fake Baker's every move. Is it coming, that moment? Baron thought. In midair, Fake Baker went pale, then a flash lit his eyes. He abruptly turned, stared at a patch of floor and raised his wand. It's coming! Impedimenta! Baron shouted. As Fake Baker lifted his wand toward that spot, Baron reacted with a stronger, unexpectedly precise counterspell. Fake Baker seemed to sense it and tilted his head so the spell glanced off. He gave Baron an almost amused look. Then his wand snapped toward another direction and spat a dazzling red beam. Even a grazing touch of that light left Baron with a wave of weariness. It was a potent stupefy. Now, Avada thought. Fake Baker's body trembled. The ropes anchoring him to the ceiling suddenly gave way at once, and he began to fall. The red light missed and dissolved into motes of glittering dust. Impedimenta! Avada shouted. Petrificus totalis, Baron added. Before Fake Baker could recover and cast levitation, the impediment jinx struck his protective bubblehead charm, and the full body bind pinned him in place. The Petrificus totalis would only hold a few seconds on someone with Fake Baker's strength, but those seconds were enough. He was falling. From over 5 meters up, he crashed to the floor with a heavy thud. I need an invisible opponent pressuring me, Avada thought. I need someone forcing me to use the supersensory charm so I'll be vulnerable when it ends. In Avada's head, the plan unfolded with cold clarity. The supersensory charm was practically designed to counter a disillusionment charm. It sharpened the senses to an almost unbearable degree, flooding the mind with environmental data so you could pinpoint disturbances and find an invisible foe in an instant. But it had a terrible cost. The deluge of information crushed mental endurance, so it could only be held for a few seconds. The moment it dropped, the mind relaxed and a prime window for attack opened. That flaw could be exploited. Pretend to find the enemy and react before the charm ended, baiting anyone who expected to strike as the sensory spell lifted. Then stop the charm for real and strike. If someone arranged a slick charm on the ceiling to trigger exactly as the supersensory charm finished, I'd be made to fall at the most dangerous instant. A confederate with a mental link could bind me mid-descent with a Petrificus totalis or binding charm so I couldn't arrest the fall, and another could break the bubblehead charm. I'd wind up with severe injuries from the fall, stripped of protections and re-exposed to any toxins or curses. Exactly the damage Professor Baker's fragment wanted to inflict on himself to buy time for something else. Professor Baker is really hard on himself, Avada thought, watching Fake Baker lying on the floor. He dispelled his disillusionment charm and stepped into plain sight, firing a stupefy at the prone figure. Ken? Fake Baker gasped. Even maimed and with a few broken bones, Fake Baker was an experienced duelist. Pain pushed him to roll away and evade the bolt. When he saw who had revealed himself, astonishment flashed across his features. While Fake Baker's attention snapped to Avada, Baron melted into invisibility behind him and slipped away. Avada could read the rest as easily as a well-worn spellbook. Fake Baker's injuries were severe enough that he would try to leave the room of requirement and seek help from other professors. The fragment's programming would make the true Professor Baker manipulate space magic to conceal the main door, forcing the simulacrum to go all out and fight to the death. Once Avada was revealed, Baker wouldn't use lethal spells on a student. He'd try to drain Ken's energy and force him to defend until help could come. That would be the plan. Fake weakness, relentless defense, and buy time for an escape. Indeed, after stabilizing his broken body as best he could, Fake Baker fell back, shielding himself while angling toward where the main door should be. When he discovered the door gone, the pressure on Avada spiked. Transfigured soldiers rose up, a waterfall materialized from nowhere overhead, fiery eruptions burst from the floor, curses able to bypass conventional shields struck as if launched from elsewhere. Magic of many kinds assailed him. It was no longer a duel. It felt like an onslaught from many opponents. Avada's single shield charm began to show strain almost immediately, and when he tried to refresh it, attacks that struck from the ground or remotely kept finding gaps. His magic senses, however, remained his edge. They fed him the precursors of spells, the slight shift before a wand arc, the spark of intent, so he could dodge or preempt many attacks as if he had foreknowledge. That perception eased the pressure somewhat, letting him appear composed amid Fake Baker's frantic barrage. No words were exchanged now, only spells and counters. Fake Baker no longer seemed interested in asking why. He wanted only to defeat the student and then extract the truth. Avada, equally focused, silently calculated each move. Across the storm of magic, their eyes met, locked on one another. Two opponents watching for the slightest twitch that would give the next opening. Professor Flitwick? Professor Flitwick? It's been nearly a minute of fighting. Baron Shafiq should be ready by now, Avada thought, while parrying fake Professor Baker's attacks with a stubborn shield charm and watching his opponent's movements. As long as he could stall until Shafiq's dark arts were prepared, this could end decisively. He glanced at the cover behind Fake Baker. That was the spot. After all this time, Shafiq's dark arts had to be ready, and he was probably watching. If Avada could keep Professor Baker's attention and then give the signal, Shafiq could spring a devastating sneak attack from behind and win it in one stroke. Excellent. Baker and I are at a stalemate. He's apparently forgotten that Shafiq exists. I can send the signal now. 3, 2, 1. Avada's left hand, which had been making auxiliary gestures for casting, suddenly stiffened. A small flaw showed itself. The shield charm's solidity dropped sharply. If Fake Baker increased the pressure right then, he might break through and end the fight. But Fake Baker ignored the opportunity. He sneered and, to Avada's astonishment, inverted his wand and pointed it at the cover behind him, firing a fierce spell straight at the hiding place where Baron Shafiq should have been. Impossible. Avada's alarm spiked. How had Baker seen through his setup? Before he could react, the spell struck the cover, but the magical signature felt wrong. It wasn't a hit on a person, nor a simple block. With a thunderous crack, a bright glowing smoke billowed out from the cover and poured across the entire room. The smoke was made of countless tiny luminous motes. Before Fake Baker could do anything, some of the particles got into his eyes, bringing sharp, stabbing pain and uncontrollable tears that almost blinded him. Someone invisible is involved. Avada realized. They were trying to read minds. They must be going to use legilimency to probe my thoughts since Shafiq is invisible and I am stalling. My energy can't sustain a super-sensing spell anymore. It has to be legilimency. The thought was accompanied by another, as if coming from the attacker. If Avada tried to resist, he would use occlumency while meeting their gaze to feed false impressions. Avada had studied Snape's mind structure for half a year in class. Of course he knew occlumency. If someone attempted legilimency now, they'd be gambling, because Avada could employ occlumency and possibly give them false information. That would make the legilimens' next moves unpredictable. Fake Baker treated his burning eyes in instinctive panic, his heart pounding. He had never been seen through so completely, never had an opponent anticipate his habits and counter them, forcing him into this abject state against 2 first-years. Who knew him this well? Although I don't know why you understand me so well, he thought, voice trembling. You underestimated my skill. Under the cover of bright smoke, Baker dodged spells by sound and instinct. He twisted and flailed, then suddenly whipped his wand toward an apparently empty wall. A dazzling blue light struck with a sound like shattering glass. For a moment, the entire space of the room of requirement contorted like a pretzel, then snapped back as though nothing had happened. But the room's hidden door had reappeared in its original place. That was the secret Fake Baker had been working on from the start. Even while exchanging blows with Avada, under the strain of curses and poisons, he had been probing the room's spatial magic. The sudden reveal told him someone had been using spatial concealment to trap him. So while he had been outwardly attacking Avada, he had been secretly searching for flaws in the spatial wards, and his skill, born of countless battles, finally found a crack. Spending the last of his energy, he hurled a few quick movement spells at himself, then charged toward the door with such speed he left after images. The spatial concealment was trying to hide the door again. He had to get out before it did. If he could reach Hogwarts and get back into Dumbledore's domain, all of their schemes would be undone. And Professor Flitwick lived on the 8th floor. A wizard of his caliber could help him escape. His hand closed on the smooth wooden door. Riding the momentum of his charge, he pushed it open and tumbled through, out into the 8th floor corridor. The familiar tiles, the tapestries, one depicting a troll assaulting Barnabas the Barmy, flashed past, and for a moment Fake Baker wanted to laugh. His remaining sanity restrained him. He called out, voice cracking, "Professor Flitwick, help! I've been attacked!" The door slammed into the wall with a bang. Professor Flitwick, hair mussed and still in pajamas, looked as if he'd been dragged from bed, but he scurried over and gasped at the sight of Baker. "Merlin's beard! Professor Baker, what happened to you?" "Someone in that room attacked me. They might be coming out. Be careful. They're very skilled and they're controlling 2 first-year students." Baker waved a trembling hand toward the doorway as if he might faint. "Good heavens. Oh, Albus, you're here too? Excellent." Flitwick's relief turned instantly to action. "Professor Baker, stand still!" From nearly point-blank range, before Fake Baker could react, Flitwick flicked his wand and loosed 2 incredibly swift spells. Expelliarmus, Incarcerus. Fake Baker's astonishment was total. What is he? He barely had time to question Flitwick when the room of requirement door in front of them swung open again, and there, framed in the doorway, stood Baron Shafiq. His wand glowed a ghastly, icy blue that make the marrow in one's bones chill at a glance. Dark arts. Soul-freezing charm. That was the last coherent thought Fake Baker had before consciousness stole away. Chapter 34. The dust has settled. After Fake Baker's body was completely covered in that eerie blue frost, the figure posing as Professor Flitwick, who had been hiding to one side, finally let out a sigh of relief. His whole form seemed to melt like wax and stretch taller. Seconds later, he shifted into a different appearance, Avada Kedavra. "Mr. Ken, what do you want to say?" Professor Baker asked. "Professor," Avada began, "according to what you told us, by now you, that is, the fake you, should be fully focused on breaking the spatial enchantments and trying to get out of the room of requirement, and the wards you set would make it difficult to stop him, correct?" "Exactly," Baker said. "So what I'm saying is, if we can't stop him, we won't try. Or rather, we don't need to stop him. We'll let him run into a trap of his own making." Avada nodded as Baker continued. "The room of requirement has a second property besides opening a room to match the user's needs. Once you're inside, the room's contents can change again to match changing needs. The space can expand, the furnishings can be altered. So why not build a fake 8th floor corridor inside the room of requirement?" Avada finished for him. "Neither you nor your consciousness fragments are judged by the room," Baker went on. "Only Baron and I can modify it. We can create and hide a fake 8th floor corridor inside the room beforehand. During the fight, when you use spatial magic to hide the real door, the invisible Baron can take the opportunity to manipulate the room with his mind and use the fake corridor to block the real doorway. Then, even if Fake Baker breaks the spatial magic and finds the location of the door, he'll only push open a fake door and step into a fake corridor, still trapped inside the room of requirement," Avada said. "At that point, he'll probably lower his guard as soon as he's in that corridor, feeling like he's escaped. If I then drink polyjuice and pose as Professor Flitwick or another professor pretending to help, his last shred of vigilance should vanish. The only problem is that I don't know how to brew polyjuice, and I don't know the timing for drinking it." Baker smiled. It turned out Avada had overestimated the difficulty of the polyjuice potion. Brewing it required no exotic magic, just strict timing and the right ingredients. Add specific components in the correct way at designated times, then let it simmer for 10 days to 2 weeks. In other words, with the recipe, the ingredients, and a bit of patience, anyone could brew it. It was merely forbidden because of the potion's unique and powerful effects, regulated, not magically prohibitive. As for the rare ingredients, some were gathered in the Forbidden Forest. Others Avada had purchased himself, paying for them and writing to potion suppliers in Diagon Alley. He had money. There was no need to steal from Snape's stores. Professor Flitwick's hair was even easier. Being an elderly British gentleman, hair loss was inevitable. Finally, on Baker's suggestion, Avada and Baron arranged a flash smoke diversion to blind fake Baker for a moment. That would be when Avada drank the polyjuice and changed, and when Baron began setting up the dark arts. Everything was timed to a hair, and it had worked. From start to finish, every move fake Baker made had been predicted and accounted for by the three of them. The whole thing had been a trap with no chance for a comeback. The battle had been intense and exhausting, but Avada and Baron had been steady throughout. Phew, it's finally over. Avada, back in his original form, threw a robe around his shoulders and collapsed to the floor. Between the fight and the constant deception, his energy was drained. He wanted nothing but to lie down and sleep. Baron at his side looked a little pale, too. The last dark arts spell had cost him some mental energy, but it wasn't serious and would heal in a few hours. "Yes, it's over," Baron said, leaning against the wall with a tired smile. The two of them had spent months sacrificing nearly all their free time after classes to Baker's training so they could execute this plan. Despite Baker's careful staging, nothing they'd learned went beyond a fourth-year level, but it had been grueling nonetheless. The payoff was obvious. Their strength had leapt forward, and even Baron had no clear idea where he stood now. Hey, one last thing." Baker's strained laugh cut through the moment of relief. "Cough. Sorry, I almost forgot." The two of them hustled to obey. Using a levitation charm, they raised Professor Baker and brought him to the black crystal ball. Baron waved his wand, first dispelling the frost that continued to bite at Baker's form, then activating the confession enchantment. As the spell took hold of his senses, a golden light shot from the black crystal ball into the center of Baker's forehead. Immediately, his body convulsed. Veins stood out on the backs of his hands and his brow as if he'd been seized by acute pain. Avada forced himself to stay alert and watched Baker's spirit carefully. Under the influence of the confession magic, Baker's primary spiritual energy and its accompanying magic void had been drawn back toward his body, slowly merging with the residual spirit that had remained there. Two magic voids, one large, one small, inched toward one another, and at a painstakingly slow pace they drew together until they blended into a single, indistinguishable whole. "Ugh!" Baker suddenly thrashed and sat up like a fish fighting for air, which startled both Avada and Baron. He sucked in a few deep breaths, wiped cold sweat from his brow with the corner of his sleeve, and then smiled at them, relieved, exhausted, human again. "Merlin, I'm finally back," he murmured. He shifted his weight, let the tethers on his sleeves settle back into ordinary sleeves, and, acting less disheveled, picked up the crystal ball. Then he did something that made both boys relax completely. He opened the real door of the room. "Don't worry, you're the ones who saved my life. Even without a signed contract, I'd never harm you. Go home and rest first. The reward I've arranged will take a little time. Come to my office tomorrow night. Besides the promised galleons and knowledge, I've planned a few extras. I promise you that these past few months of effort won't be wasted. All right, go shower, change, and tell your friends you can hang out and study with them again. Ha!" he added, trying to make light of the situation. In the end, they returned Professor Baker's wands to him and left the room of requirement together. Watching the older man walk away, Avada frowned. There was still something off about the way Baker's spiritual energy registered to him. The sense of wrongness he had felt earlier hadn't entirely vanished. That suggested Baker had merely allowed his main soul to return to his body. He had not fully reconciled his primary consciousness with all the fragments, had not entirely reintegrated his soul. In short, the confession spell had brought the main part of his spirit back, but had not completed the restoration Avada had expected. If confession didn't directly repair or wholly restore a soul, then why did Professor Baker choose that name for the spell? When Avada stepped back into the familiar Hufflepuff common room and saw those familiar faces, all the earlier thoughts evaporated. All he wanted now was a good sleep, and then to wake up whenever he pleased. He acted on that impulse immediately. After greeting Cedric, his 3 roommates, and a few other friends, He went straight to the dormitory, collapsed onto the soft bed, and was out cold. He opened his eyes contentedly some time later and went down for breakfast, only to be met by shocked Hufflepuffs. "It's already 9 o'clock at night. You slept for 14 hours straight." Summer's tone was exaggerated. "I went to your dorm half a dozen times, asking if you wanted lunch or dinner, but you were snoring so loudly you couldn't hear a thing. 14 hours just vanished." Avada froze for a moment and then realized what had happened. "I must have been under too much stress before. My mind was always tense. Now that the pressure's lifted, I finally relaxed, and I slept longer than I meant to. I'm fine, really." "Of course you're fine," someone said, "but we saved you a portion of dinner. The problem is..." "The problem is," Avada prompted, "if you only wake up this late, you won't be able to sleep tonight. What about tomorrow's classes?" A senior who had earlier sold Avada a wit-sharpening potion had overheard them and chuckled. "You could just brew a sleeping draught. It's easy. Heat daffodil root powder with wormwood, and..." "I'm only going to be sleepless for one night, and you want me to take the draught of living death?" Avada exclaimed. "No, what you're describing is only the simplest sleeping potion, a base for the draught of living death. The real draught of living death is much more complicated, at least 6th year level to brew properly." In the end, under the senior's insistent suggestion, Avada brewed a simple sleeping draught and drank it before bed. He asked his roommates to make sure they woke him on time in the morning, and if they failed, to give him an invigoration potion. After a stern word from Professor Snape about overusing invigoration potion, Avada finished the day's lessons. He ate a quick meal in the Great Hall and went straight to the 3rd floor. He resisted the urge to cast a disillusionment charm and walked to the familiar Defense Against the Dark Arts office. Baron Shafaki was already waiting there. The two exchanged a look, nodded, and knocked. The door opened with a soft click to reveal Professor Baker, smiling from within as if he had known they were there all along. "Come in quickly. Your rewards are ready." Once they were inside, Professor Baker closed the door, went to his desk, and pulled a large open bag from a cabinet. "First, 500 galleons each." He looked at them matter-of-factly. "I know you're not short on money, but 500 is not nothing. I've included the cost of the materials you bought yourselves. It's all in this bag." "Don't refuse unless you think my life isn't worth 1,000 galleons," he added with a dry smile. He set 2 money pouches on the desk and then placed 2 identical small booklets beside them. "And then there's this." He smiled a little more mysteriously. "This is the highlight of today." "What is it?" they asked. The booklets were small. How much could they possibly contain? "Do you remember the double casting I mentioned?" Professor Baker asked. "These booklets explain how to learn double casting." "You're giving us your trump card?" Avada said, startled. He remembered Baker's warning from the beginning. At the start of a duel, if you didn't knock away Baker's first wand, he could use 2 wands at once, double casting, and that would make things several times harder. "Surely you don't mind us knowing it?" "I trust you won't leak it carelessly," Baker said. "And it isn't as gloriously powerful as you imagine. Double casting is essentially multitasking. It drains the mind far more than regular magic. It can't be used all the time, and it doesn't magically double your combat power. It's a trick for breaking a stalemate. Even so, it's deadly to those who don't know it. Most of my toughest opponents fell to it, including Aethelred. I deliberately hid it in the memories I shared." He reached into the bag again and produced 2 more books. These 2 contain the true theory of confession magic. When I had you set the charm up, you only followed instructions. You didn't grasp the principles. Now that you managed it, this knowledge might be useful to you. But it's deep and not entirely complete. Don't expect to understand it fully before graduation. Finally, I have a personal gift for each of you." He set the 2 books down and took out a familiar black crystal ball. Baron went pale as soon as he saw it. "This is for Mr. Shafaki." "Professor," Baron stammered, "is this?" "Yes, it's the vessel that once housed my consciousness." Baker watched Baron's reaction and chuckled. "I know what you're thinking, but don't worry. It's just an ordinary prophecy sphere now. It won't suddenly suck your mind in, unless you somehow split your own consciousness like I did and learn how to use it through a lot of secret research." It has two functions. First, it's extremely durable, can withstand fiend fire for a few seconds. Second, once a month it can perform a prophecy about the danger level of the next thing you plan to do. When you invoke that function, 1 to 7 stars appear inside. The fewer the stars, the safer. 7 stars means very dangerous. I've written the exact usage into a booklet that comes with it. And when you get stronger, you can study it. You might discover magical and practical techniques that will be very useful. As a thanks for saving my life, Mr. Shafaki, are you satisfied? Baron relaxed visibly. Why disguise it as a prophecy ball? He asked. Because people will then think it's just another scrying device, Baker said casually. They won't suspect it once held a wizard's consciousness. Baker hesitated for a moment, then a different expression crossed his face, something like conflicted hesitation. Now, Mr. Ken, he produced a final item from the bag, a giant book, as thick as a dictionary and the size of a magazine. It was bound in a pitch-black cover and secured with strange, unfamiliar straps. I need to bind this to you. Put a drop of your blood on it so only you can read it. Avada stared, then produced a needle, pricked his arm, and let a drop of blood fall onto the cover. He tried not to wince. He hated the pain of pricking a fingertip. All right, he said. Professor Baker pushed the heavy book toward him and met Avada's eyes. The knowledge inside will likely touch the deepest, most fundamental mysteries of this world. It's incredibly profound and compelling. But if you lose caution and reverence while exploring it, you may pay an unknown price. I have suspected you hid something from the start. When you identified my vessel as a dark arts object, I began to suspect. Later events confirmed it. I also believe you have the character to handle this knowledge, so I'm giving it to you as thanks for saving my life. Don't refuse. If you think it too valuable, use it to do things you consider worthy. To reduce the risk, I've sealed the book so you cannot open it or study it until your 6th year. As Avada and Baron left the office and closed the door behind them, Professor Baker leaned back in his chair and sighed. A super strong magic perception? Or direct sight of origin? He murmured to himself. 36. Ends and New Beginnings. For Avada, the next few months felt almost like a holiday. There were normal classes, normal homework, normal revision and exams. Outside of that, a little time was spent studying lore and trying to decipher the diadem, while the rest of his days were passed chatting with friends, relaxing, picnicking, and attending tea parties. There was no Dark Lord hanging over his shoulder causing trouble, no basilisk lurking in the sewers, no dementors prowling the grounds, and no one sealing their soul into a horcrux and then begging for help. If there was any life more pleasant than this, it would probably be not working after graduation, lying around at home, and living lazily off 20 galleons a month from the ministry. As for the things Professor Baker had left them, Avada and Baron poked at them briefly and then put them aside for the moment. The crystal ball was still cooling down. The confession notes were utterly incomprehensible, and the 500 galleons had nowhere to be spent at school since they couldn't go to Hogsmeade yet. Still, Avada watched the huge sealed book carefully and figured he might be able to break its seal by hand next year. He was curious what Professor Baker meant by calling it the most fundamental, most essential mystery. Then came the end-of-year exams for the first year. Avada, confident in his abilities and certain only Baron could challenge him, had set his sights on being top of the year. He brewed a flawless forgetfulness potion, made a pair perform a miniature swan lake, turned a mouse into a charming snuff box, accurately identified Devil's Snare concealed among vines, and even remembered that the wizard who invented the self-stirring cauldron was named Gaspard Shingleton. But he missed one question in astronomy. The result, first place, with full marks across the board, went jointly to Baron and a bright, hard-working Ravenclaw girl. Avada scored full marks in his other 6 exams and scraped into 2nd place, enough to earn him a respectable reputation in the Hufflepuff common room, though he still couldn't compare to Cedric, who had been top of their year for 2 consecutive years. Tonks, the Hufflepuff prefect, returned at the end of term to sit her NETs and passed impressively. She walked away with enough qualifications to be recruited by the ministry's Auror office. The Hufflepuffs celebrated with a full-day feast by the Black Lake, food and drink laid out without end, and students from other houses drifting in to join. Even several professors came at Professor Sprout's invitation. Baron, at last, accepted the invitation to attend the banquet, which delighted Avada. At the end-of-year feast, thanks to some extreme point calculations from Professor Snape, Slytherin took the House Cup once again, its 6th consecutive victory. The Great Hall was decked in silver and green, and the Slytherin cheers rang long and loud, mostly from the younger students who still found winning exciting. Hufflepuff did not come last this year. Dumbledore had awarded Tonks a significant number of points for her achievement, lifting them off the bottom. So the unenviable last place fell to Hufflepuff's unlucky sibling, Gryffindor. With the Savior scheduled to arrive next year, there was every reason to expect Gryffindor would bounce back. With Tonks's return and the gossip that followed, nearly everyone at Hogwarts knew the famous Savior, Harry Potter, would be starting next year. Conversations inevitably circled around him, where he was living, which house he would be sorted into, whether his magic was already stronger than Dumbledore's, and so on. Avada had no intention of joining those debates. He'd listen for amusement and shrug at the wild theories. Yet, as the topic spread, teachers began looking at him with odd, teasing expressions. It took him a moment to catch on. His own name, Avada, was the first part of the killing curse, Avada Kedavra. Harry Potter, of course, was the first person in history to survive that curse, the boy who lived. Avada was equal parts amused and annoyed by the professor's behavior. Did they want him to cast a literal Avada Kedavra to prove the name? Or were they simply hoping someone named Avada would be present to eat the melons, to watch the coming gossip with them? Either way, the attention was a nuisance. Aside from Potter's impending arrival, another surprising piece of news had rippled through the school. Professor Benjamin Baker, who had been a diligent, genial, and brilliant teacher, apart from a few months after Christmas, had resigned. The official explanation said that he had suffered an accident while attempting to push a transfiguration breakthrough, which had drained him almost entirely. He needed to step down and focus on recuperation in hopes of a full recovery with no lasting damage. Avada and Baron suspected something more private. Baker was likely dealing with fragments of his own soul or consciousness, but they didn't know how he planned to resolve it. Would he create another vessel? Find a way to heal himself? They had no answers. On the Hogwarts Express, heading toward King's Cross, Baron had just finished discussing Professor Baker when he slapped his knee and turned to Avada. "Oh, by the way," he said, "do you want to visit my home this summer?" "Of course, if your parents don't mind," Avada replied. "They won't. My family doesn't believe in blood purity. No one would look down on you for being Muggle-born. If my father knows you're still second in the year, he'll be even more eager to meet you. Then I'd be honored. But first, I want to go back to the orphanage for a while. My friends there haven't heard from me in a year. I should let them know I'm safe." "Of course. What's the address? I'll pick you up." "It's called Miller Orphanage, and the address is—" Avada began, then paused. "Wait, how are you planning to pick me up? That's the Muggle world. Be careful about the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy." "We have a car," Baron said. "If we don't activate its magic, it's just an ordinary Muggle car. Our driver is a house elf, and he can be made to look exactly like a human." "Good. When shall we go?" "Mid-August. How about the 10th? "That works. Thanks for the invitation." The train gave a long, low whistle as it slowed into King's Cross. The platform was crowded with adults, witches and wizards peering over shoulders and craning their necks, trying to spot their children. Next year, everything would begin. Harry Potter, the trio, the Philosopher's Stone, Quirrell, Lord Voldemort. After saying goodbye to Baron and leaving the crowded platform, Avada stepped out into the street, took a deep breath, and hailed a cab. "Miller Orphanage," he told the driver. Chapter 37. Limitations of Magical Senses. Privet Drive, Little Winging, Surrey. It had been a week since the holidays began. Avada had already returned to the orphanage and settled back into the routine, playing with friends, helping the older caretakers, and answering questions about his school life. He picked out the non-magical highlights to share, things like the baking club and the super fierce chemistry teacher. Still, he had felt all week as if he'd forgotten something important. On the train to Surrey, On a little pilgrimage to see the boy who lived, it finally hit him. He had forgotten to remove the trace from his wand while he was still at school. He couldn't risk bringing his wand along, so he'd left it at the orphanage and come to Privet Drive empty-handed. Wandlessly, he cast a disillusionment charm on himself and watched Harry Potter through the window, who looked to be washing dishes. A rush of emotion hit him. His magical sense was not omniscient. In theory, it let him perceive the magical structure of everything, but there were things it simply could not detect, things that should be tied to magic but left no visible pattern. Time, fate, love. Even though the wizarding world had time-turners and divination, Avada could find no magical structures that corresponded to those concepts. He'd spent a year hunting for the curse Voldemort had placed on the Defense Against the Dark Arts post, and still couldn't find it. He hadn't understood why killing could cleave spiritual power. And now, standing here, he felt the limits again. Harry, right in front of him, looked utterly normal. No sign of being occupied by another soul fragment, no protective wards showing up in his senses. If it weren't for a faint, unsettling tug from Harry's spiritual signature, something like Professor Baker's intuition, Avada might have wondered if he'd slipped into the wrong world. He had expected to see a powerful blood-based ward, something that replenished strength through kin and could even reflect Avada Kedavra. Instead, there was nothing. That realization was a blow. In his plan to bury Voldemort, the piece of soul on Harry was the biggest complication. Destroying that fragment directly would mean waiting until Harry turned 17 and Lily's protection faded, and then having Voldemort himself cast the Avada Kedavra. But if that happened, Voldemort would revive, wreak havoc, and kill people. How was that better than the original story? That was why Avada had been so eager to research magic that could destroy Horcruxes without annihilating their host objects. Yet now, if he couldn't even locate Voldemort's soul in Harry, that research might not even help. If I could capture and seal Voldemort's remnants next semester, I'd have time, he muttered. Ha! Right, as if Dumbledore could. He laughed at himself. The first book in the original timeline had been a trap Dumbledore set, from bringing the Philosopher's Stone into school to hiring Quirrell and arranging those childish protections first years could get through. Still, Voldemort slipped away. How good was that man at escaping? Avada frowned and felt his plan thinning. Maybe he should just quietly poison Voldemort's father's ashes after all. He sighed, ended the disillusionment charm, and turned for the station. Today's trip had been useless. The weakest moment is right in front of me. Why can't I use it? Seal, seal. Then he froze. He'd thought of a very, very bold plan. So bold he wondered if the Sorting Hat had made a mistake. Summer at the orphanage was ordinary, simple, and a little boring compared to life at Hogwarts, but Avada liked it. That was part of why he wanted Voldemort gone, so he could enjoy normal days, playing, tutoring younger kids, showing off his Hufflepuff baking in the evenings, then locking his door to do Hogwarts homework. Before long, it was mid-August. Hey, Avada, someone's here to see you outside. They said they're your friend. Is it Baron Shafiq? A boy called down. Avada shivered at the name. He was used to being called Ken at school, and lately, with all his plotting, his own given name felt strange. Baron? He's here? Just a moment. A few days earlier, Baron had sent a letter inviting Avada to Diagon Alley to buy supplies for the term. Baron's family had welcomed him as a guest. Pure-blood families didn't have the same restrictions on magic during the holidays, so Avada had already packed. He grabbed his suitcase and went downstairs. Baron stood by a black sedan, surrounded by orphanage kids, laughing with them. Beside him stood a short, well-dressed old man who looked like a house elf in disguise, though how he'd gotten those clothes was anyone's guess. Ken, over here, Baron called in his clear, quiet voice. Avada walked up grinning. What were you all talking about? Oh, school, so interesting, one of the kids began. Potions class? Another supplied. That's what I call chemistry class, the super fierce professor. Baron says it like that. We're in different houses. Their house isn't as good at baking as ours, but they've got other strengths. They even won the championship this year. Broomball? Is that what Baron calls it? Poo-ha-ha-ha. Of course, there's astronomy. Every Wednesday, we go to the astronomy tower and use telescopes to watch the stars. That's why the school's unique. And the headmaster from last time, he didn't cut his beard. He likes that look. The kids dispersed, content. Avada rubbed his forehead and laughed. Okay, your secrecy is appreciated, but broomball might be a bit much. If you're going to make things up, at least pick something like football or basketball. Baron breathed as if he'd dodged disaster. He turned to the short man and introduced him. I haven't introduced you. This is Charlie, our family's house elf. He handles our household. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Charlie, Avada said. Just call me Charlie, Mr. Ken, and wizards don't need to be formal with house elves, Charlie replied with a small, polite smile. All right, Mr. Ken, Charlie said. Please give me your trunk and get in the car with young Master Baron. It's about a 15-minute ride. Avada nodded, about to hand over his case, then paused. I have my wand with me. If this car uses magic, will the trace pick it up? Don't worry, the trace isn't that sensitive, Baron answered before Charlie could. They climbed into the car. The interior seemed to expand beyond what the exterior suggested. The seats were comfortable, and there was more room than the black sedan's size implied. Seatbelts on, gentlemen. We'll depart shortly, Charlie said. A faint hum came from the back of the car. There was a clang, and then, with a sudden jolt, the scenery outside the windows changed. 38. Shafiq Manor. As old Charlie had said, the car stopped after about 15 minutes. Because of the vehicle's frequent spatial jumps, Avada couldn't tell exactly where they were or how far from London they had come, but judging by the night bus's speed, they were probably in north-central Britain. They had pulled up beside a small house in a wide, grassy plain. From the window, Avada saw an endless stretch of flat, emerald green land that rolled into gentle waves before meeting a clear blue sky. A few thick white clouds drifted low, each pattern sharp and distinct as if he could reach out and touch them. The little white house with its gray roof sat alone on the grass, a narrow path leading away to a distant road. Beside the house was a paved stone area where their car was parked. Old Charlie was the first out. He opened the car door and invited Avada and Baron to step down. A cool, humid breeze brushed Avada's face, carrying the clean scent of fresh grass. This place is wonderful, he said, unable to help the sincerity in his voice. Of course, Baron replied with a smile. Beautiful, peaceful, far from human habitations. To be honest, the muggle-repelling charms hardly ever need to be used here. We can ride brooms, camp, and walk Krupps across the fields as we like. Master, let us go inside. Old Charlie had already taken Avada's luggage from the trunk. Under Avada's curious stare, the old man changed. His hair vanished, his ears lengthened, his eyes grew larger, and his skin took on a gray-brown tone. The short old man became an even shorter house elf. He smoothed the suit he'd been wearing, and it transformed into a sheet-like fabric wrapped around him, surprisingly neat. Carrying the luggage in one hand and a key in the other, he opened the front door and entered. Avada realized at once the little house contained a remarkable spatial structure. No pure-blood noble's home was as simple as it looked from the outside. He followed Charlie and Baron in without a word. The house was smaller than the burrow from the movies. The furniture was spotless, but spare, only a table and a few chairs, almost not like a lived-in place. I am Charlie, the house elf announced from the center of the room, as if addressing someone. I have returned with young Master Baron and his guest. He crossed to a closed back door, traced a few runes on the panel with his finger, and then turned to Avada with a smile. Welcome to Shafiq Manor, Mr. Ken. Charlie opened the back door gently. What lay beyond rendered Avada speechless. Behind the small house the plain stretched on, but nearest the house was a paved yard where their car stood. A broad flagstone path ran straight from there to an impossibly grand manor Avada had never seen in either of his lives. Following the path, the first sight was a magic fountain. Its spray didn't refract rainbows, but seemed to float as specks of starlight. Exquisite stone statues and orderly rows of trees framed the fountain. Beyond it, a courtyard, smaller than the whole estate but breathtaking in detail, unfolded. Flower beds, gazebos, outdoor tables, ponds with strange fish, all perfectly arranged. The marble villa at the center was unmistakably the Shafiq family home. Heavens, Avada breathed, though having seen Hogwarts before helped him keep his composure. All right, let's go, Baron said, amused by Avada's reaction. He led him up to the big house door. knocked loudly, then stepped back 2 paces. A soft click answered, and the double doors slid open to reveal a corridor lined with deep red carpet and several oil paintings. The carpet seemed to clean shoes as they walked, so they didn't need to change footwear. Baron guided Avada down the hall into an impressive reception room. 2 people were seated there, chatting. They turned with welcoming smiles when they heard the footsteps. "Baron, you're back?" The burly middle-aged man called, then rose and came toward them. He looked straight at Avada. "You must be Ken. Hello. Baron's mentioned you a lot these past few days. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Shafiq." Avada shook the man's hand and bowed slightly to the woman beside him. "I am Johnson Shafiq, and this is my wife, Johnson," the man said, offering a curious look as he studied Avada. "May I ask your full name?" Baron grinned. "Baron only ever calls you Ken when he mentions you. When I asked for your full name, he wouldn't tell me, said Headmaster Dumbledore asked it be kept secret." Avada swallowed and tried to explain without making things worse. "Ahem, the Killing Curses incantation." "What? My name is the Killing Curses incantation. Ken comes from the second word of the incantation." The Shafiqs exchanged puzzled looks and then glanced at Baron, who only nodded. "The Killing Curses incantation?" Mr. Shafiq repeated hesitantly. "You mean Avada?" "Yes," Avada said. "My name is Avada, and my surname is Kedavra." The couple burst into a flurry of questions. Who gave you that name?" "It was the Department of Mysteries." Avada explained, as best he could, the absurdity of how his name had been treated as something to hide at Dumbledore's request. The story left him with his hand on his forehead, Baron barely containing his laughter, and the Shafiqs exchanging blank, incredulous looks. They had assumed that someone Dumbledore wanted kept secret might be the scion of some foreign noble family or the child of a person with a sensitive identity, maybe even related to someone like Grindelwald. Instead, the truth was somehow more ordinary and yet somehow odder. "Oh, by the way," Mr. Shafiq said, a mischievous glint forming in his eyes, "since your name is that, does that mean you'll run into Harry Potter as soon as school starts?" Avada felt that a joke like this was not going to disappear anytime soon. 39. Revolutionary Product, Nimbus 2000. After confirming that casting magic here would not be detected by the Ministry, the first thing Avada did was spend 2 nights using his mental power to grind the trace off his wand. He wasn't entering the Tree Wizard tournament, and no one would check his wand here, so it seemed safe. In the days that followed, Avada settled in with the Shafiq family and learned a little about them, very different from the Slytherin pureblood caricatures in the original stories. They weren't as haughty as the Malfoys, not fanatically cruel like the Lestranges, and not the oddball anti-bloodline type like Sirius Black. They were proud of their name and lineage, but they also understood where that pride came from. The Shafiqs were not only a pureblood noble family, but a prominent business family in Britain's magical industry. They held shares in many firms that made and improved alchemical products. Most notably, they owned stakes in the famous broom manufacturers Cleansweep and Comet. There were even rumors that the mysterious Floo Powder Company was backed by the Shafiqs, though Mr. Shafiq dismissed that as gossip. One clear perk of their investments was early access to prototypes and pre-release models, like the one Mr. Shafiq was about to present. "Look, children, a sample just sent by Cleansweep, their latest achievement, the Nimbus 2000, Mr. Shafiq cried, holding up a very handsome broom and waving it at Avada, Baron, and Mrs. Shafiq. 2000? Baron's eyes widened. Mrs. Shafiq, who clearly had some inside information, remained calm. Mr. Shafiq, however, gripped the handle as if he could hardly wait to ride it. The new power valve technology can control 600 power rods perfectly, synchronizing them without interference. It reaches an unprecedented 150 miles per hour, 10 seconds from 0 to top speed. Good heavens! Avada and Baron both exclaimed. 600 power rods. What a concept. From History of Magic, Avada already knew the basic structure of a flying broom, the control stick, balance spine, stabilizer, power valve, and the cluster of power rods at the end. The original inventor had maximized speed by enchanting individual wooden filaments with repelling charms, bundling them together, and putting a specially made core, the power valve, to regulate output and cancel interference. That condensed many repelling charms into a focused thruster. Unsurprisingly, when people first saw the finished product, they all said, "Isn't this just a broom?" And the name Flying Broomstick stuck. Before the Nimbus 2000, the fastest model had been the Nimbus 1705, which only had 420 power rods. "This will dominate every Quidditch pitch," Baron praised. "Perhaps only the professional pitches," Mr. Shafiq corrected with a smile. "The new power valve is expensive to manufacture, and they haven't figured out mass production yet, so output will be limited and the price likely outrageous. Probably only professional teams can afford it." "That's not all bad," Baron said. "Only pro players could use it to its full effect. Amateurs would struggle to control it and waste its performance. Better to stick with Comet or Cleansweep models for most people. Anyway, let's try it." Before anyone could stop him, Mr. Shafiq straddled the broom and whooshed into the sky. Fortunately, Shafiq Manor sat on a vast, secluded stretch of grass where they could fly without breaking the international statute of wizarding secrecy. After Mr. Shafiq had his fill, Baron and Mrs. Shafiq each took a turn. Finally, at their urging, Avada climbed aboard. The broom felt excellent, but when it neared full speed, he flinched. 150 miles per hour was almost like a high-speed train, and he didn't dare push it farther. "The Cleansweep letter says this will be unveiled and available for pre-sale in about 2 days," Mr. Shafiq said after one more exhilarating lap, wiping sweat from his brow. "We'll go to Diagon Alley to buy school supplies for the term and drop by their stall." As they walked back, Mr. Shafiq glanced up with a curious look. An owl streaked over, and as it flew past him, its claws loosened, dropping an envelope that fluttered into his hand. "Is that the Malfoy's owl?" Mrs. Shafiq asked. "Why would they be writing now?" Mr. Shafiq opened the letter and skimmed it. His expression shifted. "They want to visit in 2 days and invite us to go shopping in Diagon Alley together." "Why?" Baron and Mrs. Shafiq exchanged puzzled looks. "The letter says Draco Malfoy will be starting at Hogwarts this year, and they want to visit Baron, the top student from last year, to make friends and swap tips," Mr. Shafiq read aloud. "They also claim Malfoy Manor has bred a new variety of magic wood, a mahogany strain that might greatly reduce the load on the Nimbus 2000's power valve and make mass production possible. They seem well informed." "If it's true, that would be a good thing," Mrs. Shafiq said, nodding, though a hint of concern creased her brow. "But aren't they? It shouldn't be a big problem," Mr. Shafiq said, shaking his head. "Voldemort's been gone for over 10 years. Lucius wasn't punished and even became a Hogwarts governor. Whatever happened before, what matters is whether they can contribute now." He let out a short, somewhat ironic laugh. "Besides, Potter, who destroyed his master as a baby, is starting the same year as his son. Lucius must be worried. That's probably why he's trying to ingratiate himself." "And Ken?" Baron asked. "The Malfoys are staunch pure-blood supremacists. If they find out Ken is Muggle-born—" "I'll introduce Ken so they can't look down on him," Mr. Shafiq said calmly. "When I present him, I'll give him a name even Dumbledore would have to take seriously." 40. Lucius's confusion. "The House of Malfoy once sided with Lord Voldemort," Baron was saying softly to Avada. "So even though we're both old Slytherin pure-blood families, our relations aren't close. We barely interact. And setting that aside, we probably wouldn't get on. Though it's undignified to gossip, I'll say this much. That family hasn't exactly been model citizens over the years. Their manor focuses on cultivating various magical herbs and wood," he continued. "The quality isn't always on par with Hogwarts' greenhouses or the Ollivanders, but it's a unique strength all the same." 2 days later, at the Shafiq Manor, Baron, dressed in a proper suit, was explaining the Malfoys to Avada. Mr. and Mrs. Shafiq sat upright in the drawing room. Old Charlie and a house elf the boy didn't recognize stood nearby. The two families had always had little contact, but there was no real enmity. They'd come with business to discuss, so courtesy was in order. The doorbell rang. Old Charlie signaled, and the great double doors opened to reveal 3 figures. The man in the middle was thin and pale, with long, light blonde hair and a snake-headed cane. Lucius Malfoy. He offered a faint smile. To his right stood Narcissa, and clutching her hand was their son, a blonde boy with his hair slicked back, Draco Malfoy. Avada couldn't help an inward sigh. Mr. and Mrs. Malfoy were dressed formally and polite, with gentle, comfortable smiles that barely resembled the arrogance they remembered from other accounts. Even Draco stood unnaturally still, only surveying the room with a curious stare. It struck Avada as absurd. The Lucius he knew from stories had shot cold looks at Dumbledore and found reasons to undermine him, and that was long before the Dark Lord's return. Avada rose with the Shafiqs, but didn't step forward to greet them the way his hosts did. He took only 2 polite steps. "Long time, Mr. Malfoy, truly," Mr. Shafiq said, smiling as he went forward and took Lucius' hand. "When did we last meet?" "The trial," Lucius answered quietly, a wistful note in his voice. "You were on the jury. I was, facing charges as a Death Eater back then. You saw me declared innocent." "I don't like to remember those days," Lucius continued, "being under Imperio, muddled, hearing voices constantly. When I came to, aurors had their wands raised at me and called me a Death Eater." He trailed off. "Oh, forgive me," Mr. Shafiq said. "I've carried on. Let me introduce them properly. This is my wife, Narcissa," Lucius said, inclining his head, then turning to Draco. "This is my son, Draco Malfoy. He'll be starting at Hogwarts this year. Draco, say hello to Mr. Shafiq." "Hello, Mr. Shafiq," Draco nodded with a stiff but respectful bow. Mr. Shafiq patted the boy's shoulder and introduced his own family. "This is my wife, Joan Shafiq, and this is my son, Baron. Baron is top of his year. You should look to him as an example." "Come now, you flatter me," Baron protested, but Lucius chimed in. "And this is Ken, Baron's friend who's been staying with us for the last few days. He'll be coming with us to Diagon Alley." Mr. Shafiq gestured to Avada to come forward and meet the Malfoys. "Ken?" Lucius arched an eyebrow at the single name as Avada stepped up and gave his greeting. Mr. Shafiq's face shifted. "It's best not to ask about his true name, Mr. Malfoy," he said, suddenly serious. Mrs. Shafiq and Baron obliged with lowered heads, trying not to smile. "Why is that?" Lucius asked. "That name is a taboo," Mr. Shafiq said in a low voice, as if afraid to be overheard. "A name that even Dumbledore avoids. It's a name that once brought bloodshed to the wizarding world. Dumbledore personally handled Ken's enrollment and kept his true name hidden. Believe me, Mr. Malfoy, you don't want to hear it." No one would want to hear it, Avada thought, a cold little clench in his chest. He let the words sit in his mind, and the more he thought about them, the more convinced he became that Mr. Shafiq was being bluntly truthful. Lucius's gaze lingered on Avada a moment longer. Then the Malfoy patriarch fell back into polite conversation with Mr. Shafiq. Unseen by them, Lucius's palms were damp with cold sweat. Avada knew both Dumbledore and the Shafiqs were stubborn and unflappable. They'd speak the Dark Lord's name casually if needed. For something to be a taboo to them, to have driven Dumbledore to secrecy, it had to be serious. A name that had once caused bloodshed. No wonder, Lucius must have thought. This wasn't something trivial. Lucius' expression shifted. Avada could read his mental steps. Shock, realization, shock again, probing. Mr. Shafiq's aside had planted the seed, and Avada suspected that now Lucius would make sure Draco steered clear of trouble. Whether Lucius guessed the ancestor was Grindelwald or someone else, Avada didn't know, and he didn't correct him. "So, Ken, what house are you in?" Lucius asked, leaning in with a surprisingly gentle tone. "Hufflepuff," Avada answered. "Hufflepuff?" Lucius looked taken aback. It wasn't what he'd expected, but he quickly made sense of it in his mind. A careful upbringing, Dumbledore's influence, a plan to bury whatever tendencies that ancestor might have had, Hufflepuff could be a deliberate choice. "Hufflepuff is a fine house," he said, forcing a smile. "Do you find the studies at Hogwarts demanding? Any difficulties?" "No, it's fine. Most things are pretty straightforward," Avada replied. Mr. Shafiq broke in with a proud smile. Ken almost topped his year. He missed first place by a single point, lost just 1 mark on the astronomy exam. Otherwise, he'd have tied with Baron. Hearing that, Lucius's certainty hardened. Of course, his face seemed to say. This young man had inherited remarkable talent. No wonder Dumbledore had looked after him so closely. "Quite impressive," Lucius said warmly. "I'm glad Draco will have 2 such excellent seniors when he starts. Draco, you do well to learn from Baron and Ken." "Will do, Father," Draco answered, puzzled. He knew being first or near first was a big deal, but his father's behavior had felt odd. He'd always looked down on Hufflepuff, yet suddenly praised it. And his father had seemed nervous when he'd asked Ken questions. Who was this boy, really? Well, Mr. Malfoy, it's about time, Mr. Shafiq said with a smile. Shall we head to Diagon Alley together? I can show you the new broom display. I can't wait, Lucius said, and the two families began to prepare to leave.